Hey everyone, nearly 95% of people who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It means a lot. Also, be sure to give a video a like and drop a comment below. Your interaction helps more people discover the channel and supports its growth. Thanks a ton for being here. By the way, I'd love to know which country or city are you watching from? I had been in Ocala National Forest many times before, but that night stayed with me in a way the others never did. It was one of those trips that starts simple and ends with a feeling you cannot shake, no matter how much time passes. Nothing supernatural happened. No ghosts, no monsters, nothing like that. What made it unsettling was how real it all was, how possible every part it felt. A friend and I went out hunting hogs, the kind of trip we had planned a dozen times before. Ocala is massive, flat in places, thick in others, and at night it feels endless. The trees stretch forever, and the underbrush can be so dense that you feel like you're moving through a wall of green and black. We stayed out later than planned, not because anything went wrong, but because time slips away out there. You walk, you stop, you scan, you listen, and suddenly hours have passed. By the time we decided to head back, it was well past midnight. The moon was high and bright, enough that it lit up the tops of the palmettos and turned the sandy ground pale under our boots. Even under the trees, the light was good enough to see shapes and movement without much trouble. We were heavily armed, prepared for hogs and anything else that might wander through the forest. Between the rifles, sidearms, and knives, fear was not really part of the equation. We felt capable, alert, and steady. The trails out there are mostly old logging roads, wide and straight, cutting the forest into huge square sections. The one we were on that night was different. It was thinner, overgrown, barely a trail at all, like something that had been forgotten and slowly swallowed back by the woods. Grass and brush pushed in from both sides, and branches hung low enough to brush your shoulders as you walked. As we moved through the dark, we heard something moving fast to our right. It was not subtle. It was loud, heavy, and careless, crashing through brush and snapping branches. Whatever it was moving with purpose, cutting through the woods instead of following any trail. It sounded like it was going to cross the path ahead of us. At first, it did not raise alarm. Deer do that. Bears do that too. In Ocala, either is possible. We slowed and waited, listening to judge distance and direction. When it got close enough, I brought up my handheld light instead of using the rifle-mounted lights. The beam cut through the trees and landed on the trail ahead. What crossed in front of us made my stomach tighten. Two legs flashed through the beam, pale and bare, moving fast from right to left. They were clearly human legs. No fur, no hooves, no animal shape at all. Just legs, wearing shorts, vanishing back into the brush on the other side. For a moment, everything felt out of place. The woods went quiet again, the way they do when something moves through and then disappears. The thought settled in slowly that a person had just run through thick brush in the middle of the forest at around 1 a.m. No trail, no light, no sound of boots on packed dirt, just crashing through undergrowth like it meant nothing. We stood there for a few seconds, scanning, listening. Nothing followed. Nothing approached. The forest returned to its normal night rhythm. Insects humming and distant sounds drifting in and out. We were deep in, miles from the road, but turning back would have meant a long detour around one of the forest quadrants. We decided to keep moving forward, staying alert, paying attention to every sound. As we walked, we heard movement now and then off in the woods, never close, never clear. Branches breaking far off, brush rustling and stopping. It felt like something keeping pace at a distance, not rushing us, not fleeing either. The feeling was not panic. It was unease, the kind that sits low in your chest and makes you focus harder. When we finally reached the car, relief washed over me more than I expected. Seeing it untouched, sitting where we left it, felt grounding. We kept everything loaded and ready as we got in, then started the slow drive out along the sandy forest road. I opened the moonroof, letting the cool night air in. Above us, the sky was packed with stars, bright and sharp, the kind you forget exist when you spend too much time around city lights. It was beautiful in a way that made the forest feel calm again, almost peaceful. That calm did not last long. About half a mile down the road, my headlights picked up a figure ahead. A man was walking along the road, alone, unhurried. He wore a checkered button-down shirt and shorts. No pack, no flashlight, no gear of any kind. Just walking, hands at his sides, head forward. This was deep inside the forest, miles from any paved road. From there, it was several more miles of pavement before reaching anything resembling a town. There were no old cabins in that part of Ocala, no nearby camps, no reason for someone to be out there like that at that hour. As we passed him, he did not react. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the vehicle at all. He just kept walking, steady and silent, fading into the darkness behind us. The pieces clicked together then. The legs on the trail, the crashing through brush, the unexplained movement pacing us through the woods. It all pointed to the same person. The realization did not bring clarity or comfort. It made things feel worse. Someone had been out there with us, moving fast through thick forest in the dark, watching or tracking, or simply passing through for reasons we would never know. We continued driving, not stopping, not slowing, until we reached the paved road. Only then did we unload and secure everything properly and head home. The rest of the night passed without incident, but sleep came slow. Looking back, I did not think it was anything supernatural. It felt more like stumbling across something we were not meant to see. A camp hidden deeper in the woods. A poacher operation. A drug setup tucked away from roads and trails. Signs meant to scare people off, including the presence of someone willing to move through the forest at night without fear or light. Ocala National Forest is beautiful, wild, and vast. It holds places where people can disappear without trying. I still enjoy going back, and I still respect the land for what it is. But I never forget that night. Out there, the most unsettling things are not imaginary. They are real people doing real things, far from help, far from witnesses, in places where no one is supposed to be watching. I was a stupid kid in that age range where confidence shows up before sense does. I was somewhere between 13 and 16, old enough to wander on my own, but young enough to think a BB gun made me a hunter. No one in my family hunted. No one taught me rules, seasons, or respect beyond the basic idea of not being careless. I learned everything from magazines, TV, and my own head. When I finally got that BB gun, it felt heavy and serious in my hands. It felt like a door opening into something older and rougher, something I thought would make me tougher just by being around it. The woods near our place were not deep wilderness. They were the kind of woods kids grow up around, with old trails, patches of trash half buried in leaves, and places where you could tell people used to live. One of those places was a swampy low area where an old farmhouse had once stood. When I was very young, 2 or 3 years old, I barely remember the shape of it. By the time I was roaming on my own, the house was gone. All that remained was the stone foundation. The chimney collapsed into itself, and a square of ground that always seemed colder and wetter than everything around it. That evening I went out late, later than I should have. The light was fading fast. The sun was already down behind the trees, and the world had that flat gray look where colors give up and everything becomes shape and shadow. The swamp smelled like rot and old water. Every step made a soft sucking sound. Bugs hung in the air, and the trees stood thin and bare in places like ribs. I remember feeling both excited and uneasy. The woods get quieter at dusk, but not silent. Sounds stretch out and carry farther. Every movement feels watched, even when nothing is there. I had that feeling in my stomach that told me I should turn back, but I ignored it. I told myself this was what hunters felt all the time. Then I heard wings. Not a flutter, not a quick burst, but a deep, heavy sound that pushed air. It came from above and behind me, and it made me freeze. I looked up just in time to see a large bird settle onto the top of a dead tree near the edge of the swamp. The branch bent under its weight. Its shape stood out dark against the gray sky. I could not see details, just the size and outline. Big body, broad wings, a head that seemed too large. I assumed it was an owl. At that age, owl meant target to my ignorant brain. I did not think about laws or protected species or the fact that I was guessing in bad light. I raised the BB gun, hands shaking, breath shallow. The bird stayed still, watching something I could not see. I fired. The sound of the shot felt too loud in the quiet woods. The bird dropped straight down, wings flaring wide in a way that burned into my memory. As it fell, it let out a screech that was sharp and raw, nothing like the hoots I had heard before. It hit the ground out of sight in the brush, and the sound cut off suddenly. Regret hit me immediately. It was like my chest dropped out. I stood there frozen, heart racing, staring at the empty branch. I wanted to take it back. I wanted to believe it would get up and fly away. Then the woods exploded with sound. It came from everywhere at once. From the trees around me, from deeper in the swamp, from behind, and to the sides. A chorus of screeching and whooping calls rose up together, layered and overlapping. It did not sound like one animal. It sounded like many, dozens at least. The noise rolled through the trees like a wave, rising and falling, echoing back on itself. It was not a clean sound. It was wild and broken, full of sharp edges. The closest way I can describe it is like 100 things screaming at once, not in pain exactly, but in alarm. It felt directed, like the woods itself had noticed me. I did not wait to understand it. Fear took over completely. My legs moved before my head caught up. I turned and ran. The path back home was about a quarter mile, but it felt endless. Branches slapped my face and arms. Roots grabbed at my feet. My breath burned, and my chest hurt, but I did not slow down. The sounds followed me, rising again whenever I slowed, fading only slightly when I sprinted. I did not look back. I was sure if I did, I would see something chasing me, even if that something was only in my head. When I finally broke out of the woods and saw the edge of our yard, the noise stopped. It did not fade away slowly. It just ended. The sudden quiet was almost worse. I stood there bent over, gasping, listening to my own heartbeat and the distant normal sounds of night. Crickets. A dog barking far away. Nothing else. I did not tell anyone what happened. I put the BB gun away and avoided that part of the woods for a long time. As I grew older, the memory faded. It sank down under years of other experiences, other days. I forgot about it completely. It only came back recently, out of nowhere, clear as if it happened yesterday. When it did, I tried to make sense of it. I searched for owl distress calls, alarm calls, group responses. I listened to recordings late at night with headphones on. None of them matched what I heard that evening. Some were close in tone, but not in number or intensity. Nothing explained how quickly it started or how many voices there seemed to be. As an adult, I spent a lot of time outdoors. I hunt legally, carefully, and only for food. I pay attention now. I notice patterns, seasons, and signs. I have learned how animals react to danger, how sound can travel and multiply in certain conditions. I understand that fear can twist memory and make things feel bigger than they were. Even with all that, that night still stands out. The ending of it is clear to me now. I did not uncover some mystery or face something unreal. I made a bad choice as a kid, hurt something I should not have, and triggered a natural response I was not prepared to understand. The woods did what woods do. Animals reacted. Sound carried in damp air and thick trees. My fear filled in the gaps and burned it into my brain. The lesson stuck, even if the memory went quiet for years. That night was the moment where respect was forced into me instead of taught gently. I left the woods running, but I carried that feeling with me into adulthood. As for where I live now, the apartment is just an apartment. Old pipes knock. Floors creak. Neighbors move around at odd hours. When I am tired, my mind reaches back to old fears and tries to shape normal sounds into something else. I know better now. I remind myself of that night and what it really was. A real place, real animals, real consequences. That is where it ends for me. Not with something following me home, not with answers that defy reason, but with the understanding that nature does not need anything supernatural to be terrifying. It only needs a careless human stepping into it without respect, and a moment where the woods answer back all at once. I was on a backpacking trip in the Manistee National Forest with my Boy Scout troop, several miles deep in the woods, far from any road or town. I was still young enough that the world felt big and sharp, and nights felt longer than they do now. We had hiked most of the day through sandy soil and tall pines, our boots grinding into roots and old needles. The air smelled like damp leaves and sap, and the forest felt endless in every direction. By the time we reached our campsite, my legs were heavy and my shoulders ached from the pack straps digging into my skin. We set up camp as the sun dropped low and the light thinned out between the trees. The forest changed fast once the sun went down. Colors faded into dark greens and blacks, and the woods felt tighter, like they were leaning inward. After dinner, everyone crawled into their tents early. There was no fire left burning, just the quiet crackle of cooling embers and the soft sounds of nylon and zippers. I remember lying on my back in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark roof of the tent, listening to my own breathing slow down. At first, the night sounded normal. Wind moved through the trees in slow waves. Insects buzzed and clicked. Somewhere far off, something small moved through brush. Then the noises started. They did not come all at once. They crept in slowly, almost quietly, like the forest testing the water. A high sound echoed in the distance, thin and stretched, rising and falling in a way that made my stomach tighten. It did not sound like anything I had heard before. It was too long for an owl, too sharp for a wolf, and wrong in a way I could not explain. More sounds followed, screams that cut through the trees, shrill and uneven, shrieks that bounced from one direction to another, making it hard to tell how far away they were. Calls that seemed to answer each other, but not in any pattern I could understand. The noises echoed, twisted by the trees, sometimes sounding close, sometimes far, as if the forest itself was carrying them around. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, every muscle tight. The worst part was how long it went on. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Just when I thought it had to stop, another sound would tear through the darkness. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were sweaty inside my bag. I did not dare move, afraid that even a small sound would somehow draw attention to me. The thin wall of the tent felt useless. It was nothing more than cloth between me and whatever was making those noises. Then came the sound that shook me the most. A loud, heavy crack echoed through the woods, like a solid object slamming into a tree with full force. It was sharp and sudden, followed by a dull, ringing silence. After a few moments, it happened again, then again, spaced out and deliberate. Each impact sounded like a baseball bat striking wood. The sound traveled deep through the forest, rolling through the dark. It did not sound like a branch falling or a tree snapping. It sounded controlled, like something was hitting on purpose. I remember curling deeper into my sleeping bag, pulling it tight around my face, trying to make myself smaller. I thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. Outside the tent was pure darkness. I imagined tripping over roots, running blind between trees, with those sounds all around me. So I stayed still and listened, waiting for morning, counting breaths, trying not to panic. Eventually, the noises faded. They did not stop all at once. They thinned out, becoming less frequent, until the forest settled back into an uneasy quiet. I did not sleep much after that. When dawn finally came, it felt like being pulled up from deep water. Light filtered through the trees, and birds began to call. The forest looked normal again, calm and harmless in the soft morning light. No one talked about the night at first. Packs were loaded, tents were taken down, and breakfast was eaten in near silence. Everyone looked tired. Faces were pale, eyes heavy. There was a feeling hanging over the group, thick and unspoken. Eventually, the assistant scoutmaster brushed it off with a simple explanation, saying the sounds were just animals, unusually loud ones, and nothing to worry about. The words did little to ease the tight feeling in my chest. Later that day, while hiking along the trail, we passed a solo hiker coming from the opposite direction. He looked worn out and tense. He stopped our group and spoke with the scoutmaster for a moment. I could tell from his body language that he was upset. He had clearly not slept well. After they finished talking, we moved on. I learned later that he had also been kept awake all night by the same noises and had assumed it was our group causing them. The fact that he had been alone and heard the same thing made my skin crawl. Years passed. I grew older, but that night never fully left me. Every once in a while, the memory would surface, usually when I was camping or hiking alone. Then one day, by chance, I came across a video online. It was a recording of strange noises captured in the Manistee National Forest. As soon as I heard it, my stomach dropped. The sounds were not exactly the same, but they were close enough to bring everything back in a rush. The high pitches, the long screams, the way the sounds seemed to move through space instead of staying in one place. I did not feel excitement when I found that video. I felt a cold sense of recognition. It confirmed that the night I remembered was real, not just a scared kid's imagination. It also confirmed that whatever made those sounds was not a one-time thing. The forest had not changed. It was still out there, still deep and dark, still holding things we do not fully understand. The ending of that night is clear to me now. Nothing came into our camp. Nothing attacked us. Morning came, and we walked out of the woods under our own power. But the fear stayed because the experience taught me something simple and unsettling. There are places close to home where nature is not neat or fully explained. There are sounds and behaviors that do not fit clean labels. The woods do not owe us comfort or clear answers. Since then, I am more careful. I still enjoy the outdoors, but I respect it more. When I hear strange noises at night, I do not rush to explain them away. I remember that night in Manistee, lying in a thin tent, listening to screams and heavy impacts echo through the dark, knowing that whatever made them was real, physical, and somewhere out there in the trees. That knowledge stays with me, not as a story about monsters, but as a reminder that even familiar forests can hold things we are not prepared to meet. I've spent a lot of time in the woods over my life, enough to know the normal sounds and the normal feelings you get when you're out there at night. I know what wind through trees sounds like, what a raccoon digging around sounds like, and what it feels like when your nerves are just messing with you. This wasn't any of that. This was something that still sits heavy in my chest years later, mostly because nothing about it ever got explained in a clean way. This happened in the summer of 2019 in the Adirondack Mountains, not far from Warrensburg. My girlfriend at the time and her family had gone up for a few nights of camping. Her parents had bought a camper the year before, and it was still new enough that everything felt stiff and unused. The camper smelled like clean plastic and fresh wood, not like old damp trailers usually do. We parked it in a wooded campsite with gravel spread around it, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the moonlight. There were a couple of tents set up nearby, maybe 10 feet away from the camper, and other campers scattered through the area, but not close enough to see clearly at night. Inside the camper, I was sleeping on the bottom bunk. Her younger sister was asleep on the top bunk, breathing slow and steady. My girlfriend was lying next to me, but neither of us was asleep yet. The air was warm and still, and the only sound was the faint hum of insects outside and the occasional creak of the camper settling. My bunk had a small window right next to my head. It was tilted open just enough to let some air in, and the glass was darkly tinted. Even during the day, it was hard to see through clearly, and at night, it was basically a black mirror. I was on my phone, scrolling without really paying attention, just killing time before sleep. The light from a screen felt brighter than it should have in the dark camper. I remember thinking I should turn it off soon because I didn't want to wake anyone up. That was when I heard the gravel. At first it was faint, just a soft shifting sound, like something brushing against the ground. Then it became clearer, more defined. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. It wasn't random. It wasn't fast. It was the sound of weight pressing down and lifting back up again. Footsteps, and not a lot of them. Not the scattered pattern of an animal. Just 2 points of pressure, over and over, moving closer. My stomach tightened immediately. I held my phone still, listening harder. The footsteps kept coming, slow and deliberate, circling toward my side of the camper. Every step on the gravel sounded louder than the last, like the quiet of the woods was amplifying it. I could tell exactly where the sound was coming from, and that made it worse. Whoever wasn't stumbling around. They were walking with purpose. The steps came closer until they stopped right next to my window. So close that it sounded like the gravel was shifting directly under the wall of the camper. I froze. My phone was still in my hand, the screen glowing softly. The thought hit me all at once that whoever was outside could probably see that light, even through the tinted glass. I imagined a face right on the other side of the window, eyes level with my bunk, watching me without making a sound. I shut my phone off instantly and held my breath. The camper felt too small, too thin, like it wouldn't stop anything if someone wanted inside. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The footsteps didn't move right away. They just stayed there. That pause felt longer than anything I can remember, like time had slowed down. I didn't hear breathing or voices or anything else, just the quiet pressure of someone standing there. Then the steps started again, slowly moving away. The sound faded into the gravel, crunching farther and farther until it blended back into the normal night noises. I didn't move for a long time. My girlfriend was awake too, tense beside me, and I could tell she had heard it as well. A few minutes later, new sounds came from outside. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was fabric moving, zippers sliding, and soft, rummaging noises. The sounds were coming from the tents nearby, the same tents that had been zipped closed before we went to bed. The noises were careful, not frantic, like someone trying not to make too much sound while opening and going through things. The woods felt even quieter around those noises, like everything else had gone still. My chest felt tight and heavy. The idea that someone was right outside, touching our things, possibly checking each tent, made my skin crawl. There was no shouting, no running, no obvious panic. Just slow, controlled movement. Eventually the sound stopped. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. No more footsteps. No more rustling. Just the long wait until morning, lying there in the dark, replaying every sound in my head. When daylight finally came, everything looked normal again. The woods were calm and quiet, sunlight filtering through the trees like nothing bad had ever happened. But the tents were different. The zippers were open. Things inside had clearly been disturbed. Nothing major was taken, but it was obvious someone had gone through them. The neighboring camper, older people who had been there longer than us, mentioned that they had also heard something moving around during the night. That confirmed it wasn't just in our heads. There were no tracks that told a clear story. The gravel was too disturbed, and the ground beyond it was too hard to show much. No one was found. No reports came back. Whoever was never showed themselves and never came back, at least not while we were there. We packed up and left not long after. That campsite was skipped the following year. Even now, what bothers me the most isn't just that someone was out there. It's how close they got without being seen, how quietly they moved, and how easily they could have done more if they wanted to. The woods didn't feel haunted or cursed. They felt indifferent, like they had simply provided cover for someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and then swallowed them back up without a trace. I went to Lassen Volcanic National Park last year on a clear day, the kind of day that looks calm but feels wrong once you step into it. The drive-in was quiet, and the deeper I went into the park, the more empty everything felt. When I parked at the trailhead, there were only a few other cars, spaced far apart, like people had shown up and then spread out on purpose. The air smelled sharp, almost sour, mixed with sulfur from the vents somewhere deeper in the ground. Before I even stepped onto the trail, I felt this tight feeling in my chest. Not excitement, not nerves, just a heavy, uneasy pressure that sat there and didn't move. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the elevation, maybe the smell. I started hiking toward the thermal vents, and the feeling stayed with me the entire time. It didn't fade as I walked. It didn't get better once I settled into a pace. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. My own boots, scraping gravel, sounded like someone else walking behind me. The wind moving through the trees made me stop more than once just to listen. The trail itself was narrow in places, cutting through brush and small trees, with patches of open ground that felt exposed. Steam rose from the earth in a few spots, drifting slowly, making the place feel alive in a way that wasn't comforting. I reached the vents, stood there for a while, and tried to enjoy it. The ground hissed and breathed, hot air pushing up through cracks in the earth. It should have been fascinating. Instead, I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way that made me want to leave. I didn't stay long. When I turned around to head back, that feeling got worse instead of better. I expected relief once I started back toward my car, but it was like the trail behind me was heavier than the one ahead. About halfway back, I heard a low growl. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't close enough to echo, but it was deep and clear enough that there was no mistaking it. My body reacted before my brain did. I stopped instantly, muscles locked, breath shallow. The sound didn't repeat right away. I stood there listening, my ears straining, my eyes scanning the trees and brush on both sides of the trail. I couldn't see anything. The forest looked exactly the same as it had seconds before, which somehow made it worse. I started moving again, slowly, trying to stay quiet. That's when I saw it. A black bear, solid and calm, moving through the trees about 40 yards away. It was walking in the same direction as me, away from me, but close enough that I could see its shape clearly. The way its shoulders rolled as it walked. The dull shine of its fur where the light hit it. My heart was pounding so hard I felt in my throat. I froze again, watching it, trying to understand what it was doing. It didn't look aggressive. It didn't look scared. It just existed there, heavy and real. I kept my eyes on it and started to move again, one slow step at a time. Every part of me wanted to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. My legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The bear kept walking, sometimes disappearing behind trees, then reappearing for a moment before fading from view again. Every time it vanished, I felt a sharp spike of panic, wondering if it had changed direction or stopped. When it finally moved completely out of sight and the trail opened into a meadow, something in me snapped. I ran. I didn't think about noise or footing. I just ran as fast as my body would allow. The meadow felt endless, the open space somehow more frightening than the trees had been. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, heavy footsteps, branches breaking, breath that wasn't mine. I didn't stop until my car came into view. I covered the last stretch like my life depended on it, got into the car, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. 2 miles of trail behind me, and I felt like I had escaped something that had never fully shown its intent. I drove out immediately and went to a busier part of the park, surrounded by other hikers and noise and movement. The feeling slowly faded, but it never fully left. Another time, months later, my friend and I went to Secret Sidewalk in Niles Canyon. It's an old aqueduct, hidden and forgotten, the kind of place that feels wrong just because it exists. Getting there already felt like trespassing, even though people go there all the time. The concrete was cracked and stained, the structure half swallowed by trees and brush. The canyon itself was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like sound didn't travel the way it should. We walked to the end where the city had started to demolish part of it years ago. Broken concrete, exposed rebar, dirt pile where water once flowed. We took a few pictures and turned back, retracing our steps toward the spot where we had climbed up. The walk back felt longer than it should have. The walls of the aqueduct seemed closer, the shadows deeper. Then we heard it, loud rustling, branches snapping hard enough to echo. Not a small animal, not wind. The sound was heavy and sudden, close enough that it made my stomach drop. We froze in place, both of us trying to figure out where it came from. The noise moved, scraping through brush, breaking something thick. I couldn't see anything through the trees. My mind ran through possibilities and rejected them one by one. It didn't sound human. It was too forceful, too careless. At the same time, I knew there weren't any large animals known to hang out there. That uncertainty made it worse than knowing for sure. The noise stopped as suddenly as it started. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. We didn't wait to investigate. We moved carefully at first, then faster, keeping our eyes on the trees, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing followed us. No more sounds, just our own footsteps and breathing. When we finally climbed out and got back to a normal area, the tension drained out of me all at once, leaving me exhausted. Both experiences stayed with me because they were grounded in reality. No shadows moving on their own, no strange lights, just the clear reminder that there are places where you're not in control, where something bigger or unknown can be close enough to hear, but not see. I left both places under my own power, unharmed, but with a deep understanding of how fast safety can disappear and how your instincts sometimes know the truth long before your eyes do. A few years ago, a group of us decided to hike up to the abandoned zoo in Los Angeles. It wasn't just any casual hike. We want to get the full experience of something eerie, something that would make us question why we ever thought this was a good idea. There were 7 of us, all in our early 20s, full of bravado and a hunger for the thrill of being scared. The hike itself was about 2 hours, winding up the side of the canyon, through overgrown trails and rocky paths that made you constantly watch your step. The first half of the hike wasn't particularly unnerving. We were joking and carrying on like idiots, noticing the small nocturnal animals that scuttled across our path. Rabbits, raccoons, and the occasional skittish coyote. The eeriest sight was probably an owl perched on a low branch, its yellow eyes watching us with an unnerving intensity. But it still felt natural, part of the wilderness we were walking through. As we pressed on, the trail started to narrow. By the 3/4 mark, we were moving single file, the canyon wall pressing against our backs. The darkness was settling in fully, the night swallowing the trail behind us, and our flashlights began flickering. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. A couple of us had phones out, providing extra light, and we assumed the batteries were just dying. That's when the first real sense of unease hit me. The guy in the front suddenly froze, his beam of light swinging upward as if he'd seen something that demanded his full attention. I was the 4th in line, and it took me a second to catch up to what he was seeing. There, moving along the trail past us, was a man, dressed completely in white, from his shoes to his gloves, with hair the same shade, and a top hat perched on his head. The first thing that hit me was how out of place he looked, like he had stepped out of another era or some strange, desert-colored photograph. He walked with an unnatural grace, his steps deliberate, as if he had walked that narrow path countless times before and didn't need to watch where he placed his feet. He wasn't carrying anything, and his face was partially obscured, either by a mask or the shadow of the hat. I couldn't tell. What made it worse was that we had no space to move. The trail was too narrow for us to turn around or pass him. Our backs pressed against the canyon wall, bodies 4 sideways. The silence was suffocating. We all just watched, frozen. My hands shook, gripping the flashlight like it could somehow protect me from this man. He passed by without a glance, without acknowledging our presence, and I felt a cold spike of fear in my chest. It was one of those moments that feels like it stretches forever, even though it was probably only 10 seconds. The moment he cleared the narrow path, my knees weakened, and I was ready to cry, all my bravado evaporating in an instant. He was just gone as quickly as he appeared, swallowed by the shadows ahead. After that, we didn't say anything because words seemed useless. There was an unspoken agreement among us that the adventure had ended. We turned around, retracing our steps with a mix of urgency and fear, our flashlights flickering and casting long, trembling shadows along the rocks and shrubs. Every sound, the rustle of a small animal, the distant call of an owl, the snap of a branch, felt amplified, each one threatening to reveal something else lurking in the darkness. We moved faster, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imaginations. The hike down felt longer, more treacherous. We stumbled over roots and rocks, tripping over the uneven ground, and every so often I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man in white following us, striding along the canyon like he had all the time in the world. I don't think any of us spoke, except for the occasional curse as someone fell or caught their foot. The fear was heavy, pressing down on us in the cool night air, tangible in a way that made our earlier jokes feel naive and reckless. When we finally reached our car, parked at the edge of the canyon trail, the sight that met us was just as unnerving. There were small, faint lights, almost like orbs, circling our car quickly. At first, I thought it was fireflies, but they moved too fast, too deliberately, and then, when we focused on them with our flashlights, they vanished entirely. There was no trace, no explanation. My heart was racing, and I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with lingering dread as we climbed in. I locked the doors immediately and started the engine, tried to convince myself the night was over. We drove away slowly, keeping our eyes on the trail behind us, but it was empty, silent. The normal sounds of the city at night started to filter in as we got farther away. Streetlights flickering to life, the distant hum of traffic, and the cool safety of civilization replacing the canyon's oppressive darkness. By the time we reached the main road, my hands were trembling so badly I had to pull the wheel tight to keep control. None of us spoke about what we saw until later, and even then, it was in quiet tones, hesitant and careful. I've thought about that night countless times since. The abandoned zoo, the narrow trail, the flickering lights, and the man in white. All of it feels like a fragment of a memory too strange to fully explain. I haven't gone back, and I never will. The place has a weight to it, a sense that some things are better left alone. Whatever that man was, it wasn't human in any sense I understand, and I've learned to respect that some fears don't need to be faced head on. Sometimes, turning back is the only way to survive, and in this case, walking away was the only choice that made sense. I still drive past the canyon sometimes, and every time, I remember that narrow path, the oppressive darkness, and the man who appeared from nowhere. And every time, I make sure never to look too long at the shadows, because some things are not meant to be seen, and some nights are better left unchallenged. That night changed the way I think about courage and curiosity. The thrill of being scared isn't worth the kind of fear that lingers long after you've returned to safety. I'll never forget it, and I'm certain that if I ever went back, I wouldn't make it far before something, whatever it was, would remind me why it's better to leave some mysteries untouched. My buddy and I had just graduated high school, and like a pair of reckless 18-year-olds, we decided the best way to celebrate was by hiking the Grand Canyon. Not the easy rim-to-rim strolls that most tourists did. No, we were chasing the sort of trail that came with warnings, one labeled as dangerous and nearly impossible. Tanner Trail. The last I had read, parts of it had been wiped out by a massive landslide years earlier, but that just made it feel more like a challenge. We were young, cocky, and convinced that exhaustion was a badge of honor. We started early in the morning, the sun barely brushing the horizon. The air was dry and heavy, the kind of dryness that makes your throat scratchy after just a few steps. The trail itself was grueling. Steep, jagged, and unrelenting, with sharp rocks that cut through our worn sneakers. The canyon walls towered above us, layers of red and brown stone that glowed under the morning sun. It was breathtaking, beautiful enough that for a moment, every blister, every labored breath, every bead of sweat dripping down our faces seemed worth it. But that feeling didn't last long. The trail forced us to pick our steps carefully. Loose rocks rolled under our feet, making us stumble more than once, and every turn revealed a drop that made my stomach knot. By the time we reached the bottom of the canyon, temperatures were already crushing us. It was late June, and down at the Colorado River, the heat pressed against us like a physical weight, climbing dangerously close to 120 degrees. Every breath felt like inhaling fire, every step like wading through invisible molasses. Our water bottles were nearly empty, our shirts soaked in sweat, our legs shaking from the constant strain. The final stretch was a dry creek bed that ran along what I think was Tanner Creek. Its surface was cracked, the dust so fine that it coated our lips and nose, clinging stubbornly to the sweat on our skin. As we rounded a cluster of boulders, the canyon opened into a wider space. and that's when we saw him. A man standing alone by the water's edge, looking almost like he'd stepped out of a movie from the 80s. He had long black hair, a denim shirt tucked neatly into his jeans, and a presence that felt entirely separate from the scorching, barren canyon around him. At first, we hesitated. We hadn't seen a single person the entire hike. The thought of someone existing in this heat, in this isolated place, without any gear or visible supplies, felt wrong, almost surreal. He didn't notice us immediately. He was in a trance-like state, focused on something so small and deliberate that it seemed almost impossible to detect at first. That's when we realized what he was doing. In the rapids at the foot of the creek, he was throwing a racquetball into the current. The ball would shoot downstream for 8 or 10 feet before hitting a rock and bouncing back to him. Every toss perfectly timed, perfectly executed. There was something hypnotic about it. The tiny white ball snapping through the river's turbulence, returning faithfully every time. Exhausted, we didn't linger. We were desperate to find a place to set up camp, a patch of shade, or any flat ground that wouldn't swallow our sleeping bags and rocks. We muttered hello, half expecting him to ignore us entirely. He responded, a simple greeting, then walked downstream, following the river, leaving us behind in the heat and the dust. We didn't see him again. We made camp not far from the riverbank, choosing a small sandy patch between two large boulders. By this point, the sun had dipped low enough to offer some relief, painting the canyon in reds and purples that felt almost unreal after the harsh white of the day. We collapsed into our sleeping bags, legs cramped, skin slick with dried sweat, water bottles nearly empty. The heat didn't let up entirely even as night approached. The canyon held on to it, radiating warmth from the rocks. As darkness fell, I couldn't shake the image of the man. There was something eerie about him, something unsettlingly skilled. It wasn't that he had powers or was supernatural. He was just human, but the precision of that simple trick performed in such isolation, in such impossible conditions, made me feel small and more than a little uneasy. I kept thinking about it, wondering how he could have known exactly how the current would react to a simple bounce off a rock, how long he had been practicing, how often he came down here alone. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound of shifting rock or distant water made me jump, and I kept scanning the shadows, half expecting to see him returning. My friend was snoring lightly, oblivious, but I lay awake, replaying every detail of the day. The canyon at night was different, ominous and quiet, with only the distant roar of the Colorado River reminding us of the wilderness we were trapped in. By morning, our fear had mostly faded, replaced with exhaustion and relief. The heat had lessened slightly, and the canyon's morning light made everything look almost serene again. We packed up silently, our water nearly gone, but our spirits intact. On the hike back up, the memory of the man stayed with me, a strange mix of admiration and unease. He had been real, there was no doubt, and yet the encounter felt almost like a dream. We made it back to the rim without incident. Every step upward reminded me of how small we were in that vast space, how easily the canyon could swallow anyone unprepared. Once back in the parking lot, surrounded by tourists and trucks, the canyon felt like a distant memory, a different world entirely. We recounted the hike to anyone who would listen, but always left out the part about the man. There was no reason to explain him. He didn't need explaining. Years later, I still think about him every time I see a racquetball, every time I think about precision and patience and skill that comes only from years of focus and solitude. I never understood why we saw him, why he was there, or what he was doing with that ball. Maybe it was practice. Maybe it was a ritual known only to him. Whatever it was, it left an imprint on me, a reminder that the world is full of things you can't predict, and that sometimes the scariest part of the wilderness isn't what's out there waiting for you. It's what humans are capable of when no one is watching. We never saw anyone else on that trail, and I never forgot that moment at the river, the racquetball snapping back toward him, perfectly timed, endlessly repeating. It was the most unsettling, yet strangely grounding experience of my life. I went into that part of the Mogollon room alone because I wanted real quiet, the kind you cannot get near roads or popular trails. This was high elevation Arizona, around 7,500 feet, where the air stays damp and cold and the ground never really dries out. The land up there does not look like the desert people imagine. It looks more like the Pacific Northwest, with dark soil, thick moss, tall pines, and a heavy green smell that sticks to your clothes. Ferns grew everywhere. Thorny bushes grabbed at my pants. Wild strawberries grew low to the ground, small and sour, but bright red against the mud. I had been hiking all day and never saw another person. Not a single footprint that looked fresh. I did find old signs of illegal pot grows, cleared patches, bits of old plastic tubing, rotting fertilizer bags. All of it looked years old. Sun faded, half buried. Still, that kind of thing puts you on edge because people who do that do not want to be found. I kept my head on a swivel and stayed off any trails that looked too intentional. By late afternoon, I found a bench above a creek. It was a wide ledge cut into the slope, almost flat, maybe the size of a large living room. Behind it was a steep wall of brush and loose rock that rose straight up. In front of it, the ground dropped sharply down into the creek, undercut by old floods. Once you were on that bench, you were boxed in. The only way up or down was a narrow game trail that cut through thick brush and loose stones. Any movement on that trail would be loud. Rocks would slide. Branches would snap. I chose that spot because it felt defensible and hidden. I set my tent near the back wall, cooked quietly, and watched the light fade. Clouds rolled in and swallowed what little sky I could see through the canopy. There was no moon. By full dark, it was pitch black. Not the kind of dark where shapes still exist, but the kind where your eyes never adjust. What struck me right away was the silence. Not normal forest quiet. There were no birds calling as the sun went down. No insects. No frogs from the creek. Just a faint trickle of water far below, echoing up the rock walls. When I stopped moving, the loudest sound was my own breathing. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath. The trees overhead were packed so tight that even my satellite communicator struggled to get a signal. I finally got a message out to my family, just a short check-in, and then shut everything down. I crawled into my tent early because sitting still in that silence made my nerves buzz. Sometime deep in the night, a bright white light lit up the inside of my tent. It was sudden and strong, like a powerful headlamp aimed straight at me. The tent walls glowed. My gear cast sharp shadows. For a split second, my brain locked up, then everything flooded in at once. Someone was there. No one should be there. That trail was the only way in. Whoever it was had come close enough to stand right at the edge of my camp without making a sound. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and scrambled out of the tent as fast as I could. The moment I unzipped the door, the light was gone. Completely gone. The darkness snapped back like a switch had been flipped. I stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps running away. No brush moving. No rock sliding. The silence was total. I swept my flashlight around the bench, over the trail, down toward the creek. The beam showed wet leaves, ferns shining with moisture, tree trunks slick with moss. No people. No movement. I turned the light off and listened again. Still nothing. That was what bothered me the most. A person would have made noise, even a careful one. There was no place to go quickly without sound. Then, farther out through the trees, I noticed a faint white flicker. It was not steady like a flashlight beam. It was more like a soft glow, coming and going, as if something was breathing light. It was weak, barely there, and if it had been any brighter, I might have assumed it was moonlight breaking through clouds. But there was no moon. The canopy was too thick. The glow hovered between the trunks and then slowly faded away. There was no sound tied to it at all. No wind. No movement. Just that light, and then nothing. I did not sleep after that. I sat with my back against the rock wall, flashlight off, ears straining. Hours passed. My legs cramped. The cold settled in. The creek kept trickling. Nothing else happened. No animals. No insects. No birds, even as the sky began to lighten. When dawn finally came, it was gray and wet. The forest looked normal again, but empty. I checked the trail. No footprints. No broken branches beyond what was already there. No sign anyone had climbed up or down in the night. The ground on the bench was soft, but only my own tracks were there. As the sun rose higher, I waited for the forest to wake up. It never did. No dawn chorus. No buzzing. It was as if that pocket of land was cut off from the rest of the world. I packed up slowly and left. As soon as I dropped down off the bench and put distance between myself and that spot, the forest sound slowly returned. A bird called, then another. Somewhere, an insect started up. I have camped alone many times since then. I have been scared before, but this was different. Nothing attacked me. Nothing chased me. Nothing left proof. But that bench felt watched and sealed off like a dead zone. I do not camp there anymore. I never will. That place made it clear I was not meant to stay the night, and I listened. My friends and I used to camp a lot in the El Dorado National Forest. We were not casual campers. We grew up outside, hunting, fishing, sleeping on dirt without tents sometimes. We knew how to read tracks, how to tell the difference between animal noise and human noise, and how the woods normally felt when nothing was wrong. There was a spot along Sopiago Springs we liked because it was hidden, flat, and close to water. You had to hike in a bit and cross the stream in one shallow spot. Not many people knew about it, and that was part of the appeal. One weekend we decided to do a 3-day foraging camp. The plan was simple. Try to live off what we could find and catch, and only dip into MREs if we had to. We brought a couple rifles, a shotgun, knives, basic shelter gear, and enough food to not starve if things went bad. No coolers, no big tents, nothing flashy. We parked far enough away that nobody would stumble on our truck by accident. The first night felt normal. We set up camp before dark, strung tarps, built a fire ring we had used before, and checked the area for fresh tracks. Nothing stood out. We caught crawdads in the stream, and one of my buddies got a squirrel. We cooked, ate, drank a couple beers, and settled in. The forest sounded alive. Bugs, frogs, distant owls. I slept hard and woke up sore in the good way you do after a long hike. The next day was when things changed. I noticed it first thing in the morning. The woods were quiet in a way that did not feel natural. No birds calling, no small animals moving around. Even the stream sounded muted, like the noise was being swallowed instead of carried. I tried to shake it off, telling myself animals move around and quiet periods happen, but the feeling stayed with me. It was the same feeling I'd gotten years earlier in another part of the forest, the sense that you were being watched by something that knew you were there and did not care if you knew it too. We spent the day foraging, moving slow, staying close. We found some edible plants, checked traps, and kept scanning the woods without really meaning to. I kept expecting to see fresh bear sign or mountain lion tracks, something that would explain the silence, but there was nothing obvious. No scat, no prins, no tormgrun, just emptiness and that pressure in my chest that would not go away. As the sun started dropping, my friends decided to head up the stream a couple hundred yards to handle some camp tasks. I stayed behind to tend the fire and organize gear. As soon as they disappeared into the trees, the feeling got worse. The quiet felt heavier. The shadows stretched out fast as the light faded, and the trees seemed closer than they had earlier in the day. I fed the fire until it burned high and steady. The heat felt good, but also made the darkness beyond the firelight feel deeper. I grabbed one of the rifles and sat where I could see the tree lean. That was when I started hearing the voices. They were faint and broken, like sounds carried through thick brush. Not loud enough to make out words. Not close enough to pinpoint. They came from the opposite direction of where my friends had gone. Low and uneven, stopping and starting, never steady. I told myself it could be hikers or someone camping nearby, but that did not make sense. This spot was hard to find, and nobody had passed us all weekend. The voices did not sound like people talking around a fire. They sounded like someone trying not to be heard. I scanned the trees, moving slow, forcing myself not to rush. The only light came from the fire, and it barely reached past the first row of trunks. That was when I saw movement about 50 yards out. Something shifted between two trees, just enough to catch my eye. I raised the rifle and looked through the scope. The shape was wrong. It looked human in outline, but it was low to the ground, moving on all fours. The arms were too long. The way they bent looked off, and the back was hunched like it was used to staying low. It paused for a second, just long enough for me to register it. Then it moved fast and smoothed deeper into the trees. Not crashing away like a bear, not bounding like a deer. It moved with control, like it knew exactly where it was going. After that, the sound started circling. Light rustling from one side, then another. Leaves shifting, a twig snapping here and there. Always staying just outside the firelight. Always coming from the side of camp away from my friends. It felt deliberate, like something testing how I would react. I kept the rifle up, sweeping the tree line, forcing my breathing to stay slow. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my neck. I did not see it again, but I never felt alone. The fire popped and hissed, throwing sparks into the dark, and every sound felt too loud. The voices faded, then came back, never closer, never farther, just there. When my friends finally returned, the pressure lifted just a little, but not enough to relax. They could see how shaken I was without me having to say anything. The reason they came back early was the same reason I stayed alert. They had heard the same low sounds upstream and felt watched the entire time. Whatever it was, it had moved between us without making noise loud enough to give itself away. That night, we kept the fire big and bright. We took turns watching the woods. Nobody slept. The forest stayed quiet until just before dawn, when the normal sounds slowly returned, like something had decided it was done with us. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, we broke camp. We did not pack neatly. We moved fast, checking our backs, listening for anything out of place. The hike out felt longer than it should have, every step heavy with the need to get distance between us and that place. When we reached the truck and loaded up, the relief was physical. My hands were shaking when I finally sat down. We never went back to that spot. Not once. Years later, I still think about what I saw, and I do not try to turn it into something supernatural. I believe it was something real, something that lives far enough from people to move differently and think differently. Maybe a feral person, maybe someone hiding out there for reasons I do not want to know. Whatever it was, it knew that forest better than we ever could. It watched us, tested us, and decided to let us leave. That is the part that still bothers me the most. I grew up knowing which places to respect and which places to leave alone. The land remembers everything. Even if you do not believe that, the ground still holds bones, history, and pain. I am Native American, and I was raised with rules that were not written anywhere, but were followed without question. You do not sleep near burial mounds. You do not wander through old grounds at night. You do not treat the land like it is empty just because it looks quiet. That night, I broke one of those rules, not because I wanted to, but because I made a careless choice. I was driving back from visiting family and decided to camp instead of pushing through the last few hours of the drive. I pulled off onto what looked like public land. There were no signs warning me away, no fences, no markers that stood out in the dark, just rolling grass, scattered trees, and low rises in the earth that looked natural enough if you did not know what you were looking at. I set up my tent fast. The sun was already gone, and the sky had that deep blue color that comes right before everything turns black. The air was still, heavy, and warm in a way that made sounds travel far. Crickets were loud, too loud. I noticed the small hills around me once I was done. They were smooth and rounded, not sharp like piles of dirt. They were spaced out in a way that felt planned. My stomach tightened when I realized what they likely were. I told myself it was too late to move. I told myself people would not be allowed to camp there if it was truly protected. I told myself animals make the land look strange sometimes. None of those thoughts settled right. When darkness fully came, the sounds changed. The crickets stopped all at once, like a switch had been flipped. That kind of silence always means something bigger is moving. I stayed inside my tent, laying on my back, staring at the thin fabric above me. The smell of soil was strong, like freshly turned dirt, even though I had not dug anything. Every breath felt louder than it should. Something moved outside, slow footsteps through grass. Not rushed, not careful, just steady. I listened hard, trying to count steps, trying to decide if it was a deer. The pattern was wrong. Too even. Too heavy. I held my breath without meaning to. The sound circled the tent once and stopped. I waited for the snort of an animal or the scrape of antlers. None came. After a while, the steps moved away. I exhaled and felt foolish for how tense I was. I told myself this is what happens when you camp alone with too much quiet. I almost fell asleep when a new sound started. Scraping. Not close, but not far either. Like metal touching stone. Then it stopped. Then it started again, slower this time. My heart began to pound. I did not move. I did not unzip the tent. I stayed still and listened. The scraping went on for several minutes. Then voices carried faintly through the night. I could not make out words, just low sounds. I felt a wave of anger mixed with fear when it hit me that people were out there. Real people. The worst kind. The kind who dig where they should not and take what does not belong to them. The sounds moved closer to one of the mounts. I heard dirt shifting, tools hitting rock. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where to go. That scared me more than anything else. They were not lost. They were not camping. They were doing something on purpose. An animal screamed suddenly from the tree line. A sharp, raw sound that ripped through the night. Everything stopped after that. The tools went silent. The voices cut off. I heard running, heavy and fast, crashing through brush. I did not know if they were running toward me or away. I felt frozen in place, every muscle locked. Minutes passed, then more. Nothing happened. Eventually the night, sounds came back slowly. Crickets, wind, distant movement. I did not sleep. I watched the sky lighten little by little until morning came. At first light, I packed everything without eating or resting. My hands shook as I worked. I walked around the area once before leaving. In the daylight, the truth was clear. The mounds were real. Some had been disturbed. Fresh cuts in the soil. Shallow holes covered badly with loose dirt. I found footprints that did not belong to animals. I found tire tracks leading away toward a dirt road I had not seen in the dark. I left immediately and reported what I saw once I had signal. Authorities later confirmed the land was protected but poorly marked. They also confirmed there had been issues with people illegally digging at night. The sounds, the footsteps, the scraping, all of it had a real explanation. Greed, carelessness, people who see land as something to use instead of something to respect. I did not encounter spirits. I did not see anything supernatural. What I experienced was still terrifying because it was real. People were disturbing the dead, and I had been sleeping right there among it without knowing. That is worse than any story. I learned that night that rules exist for a reason, even when no sign tells you so. I never camped without checking again, and I never ignored that tight feeling in my gut after that. The land warned me, and this time, I listened before it cost me more than a night of fear. One time a band camp always gets a laugh, but this wasn't that kind of story. This was years earlier in Wisconsin during a Boy Scout trip to a place called Aymar Indian Mound Reservation. I was still young enough to feel tough during the day and small at night. The camp sat in a wide stretch of woods that looked calm from a distance, but once you were inside it, everything felt old. The trees were tall and spaced out, their trunks dark and straight, and the ground rolled in low rises that didn't look natural once you paid attention to them. Those rises were burial mounds. They were everywhere, small rounded humps covered in leaves and grass, like the berms at a shooting range, only softer and older, as if the land itself had settled around something it didn't want disturbed. It was fall, cold enough that your breath showed in the mornings. The leaves were mostly down, layered thick on the ground, holding moisture from the day's fog. During daylight, the place felt quiet but normal. You could hear birds, distant movement from other camps, and the usual sounds of kids running around. At night it changed. The woods didn't get louder. They got heavier. Sound didn't travel the same way. It felt like everything was being swallowed. My tent was set up on a flat patch between two low mounds. At the time, I didn't think much about it. It was just where there was space. The tent smelled like damp nylon and dirt. My sleeping bag was too thin, and I could feel every uneven spot under me. I remember falling asleep, staring at the tent ceiling, watching it move slightly when the wind passed through the trees. I woke up without knowing why. No dream, no noise that snapped me awake. Just that sudden feeling that something had changed. The woods were quiet in a way that felt focused. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't fast. They weren't heavy either. Just steady. 2 steps, a pause. 2 steps, a pause. The sound was clear because of the leaves. They didn't crunch sharply. They dragged. The leaves were damp, so instead of a crackle, it was a soft scrape, like something being pulled across the ground. Whoever or whatever it was walked around my tent in a slow circle. I didn't move anything except my eyes and my head. The tent fabric felt thinner than it ever had before. I could track the sound easily. It started behind my head, moved along the side, then toward the front. When it reached the front of the tent, it stopped, right at the door. There was a pause that felt longer than it probably was. Long enough for my chest to tighten and for my breathing to slow without me meaning to. Then the footsteps started again, turning back the other way, circling around the tent in the opposite direction. The same dragging sound, the same steady pace. This didn't happen once. It happened again and again. Always the same pattern. Around the tent. Stop at the door. Pause. Turn around. Go back the other way. No stumbling. No random movement. Just deliberate walking. I didn't hear voices. I didn't hear branches breaking. No one brushed against the tent. That almost made it worse. If it had been someone lost or messing around, there would have been mistakes. There would have been sound that didn't fit the pattern. This was too controlled. I remember thinking about the burial mounds then, about how many of them there were, about how old they were. The place wasn't marked like a normal campsite. It felt borrowed, like we were guests who weren't supposed to stay long. I didn't think about ghosts or monsters. What I felt was different. It was the sense of being watched without being seen. Not hunted, just observed. At some point the footsteps stopped completely. No fading away. Just gone. I lay there until the inside of the tent started to lighten with early morning gray. When the sun finally came up, the woods looked normal again. Leaves, dirt, trees. Nothing disturbed around my tent. No tracks that I could see, though the ground was too covered to tell much anyway. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound dramatic, and part of me didn't want attention drawn to it. The second night, I slept light. Every sound woke me. Wind in the trees, a squirrel moving, someone shifting in another tent. Nothing came back. Years later, I went back to IMR as an adult, not camping, just passing through with someone who worked in conservation. I mentioned the burial mounds, and they nodded like it was common knowledge. Then they mentioned something else. The area had a long history of people moving through it at night. Not scouts, not campers. Locals who treated the land differently. People who checked the mounds after storms. People who walked the boundaries quietly to make sure nothing was damaged or disturbed. It finally clicked. The steady pace. The way the steps circled, paused, and turned back. The reason it stopped at the door every time, not touching the tent, not crossing a line. Whoever it wasn't trying to scare me. They were checking, making sure nothing was being messed with, making sure we stayed where we were. That understanding didn't make the memory less unsettling. If anything, it made it heavier. I wasn't visited by something unreal. I was just a kid sleeping inches away from ground that mattered to someone else. And someone had noticed. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't interfere. They just made sure I knew they were there. Even now, when I think about damp leaves and slow footsteps, I don't think about ghosts. I think about land that remembers who it belongs to, and people who walk it quietly in the dark to protect it. Wednesday, August 3rd, 2016, 1:40 in the afternoon. The heat in Vicksburg felt heavy the moment I stepped out of the hotel. The air had that thick southern weight to it, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every sound feel slower. After checking in, I didn't want to sit inside. I had planned this stop for a long time, so I got back in my car and drove to the Vicksburg National Military Park. I paid the $12 at the gate, took the map, and rolled forward at a slow crawl. The battlefield was quiet in a strange way. Not silent, but muted. The sound of my tires on the road felt too loud, so I eased off the gas. On both sides of me were statues and plaques, dark stone and weathered bronze, lined up like they were still standing watch. Names were carved into everything. Dates, regiments, ranks. The sun beat down on the stones and made them shine in places almost too bright to look at directly. I knew I was driving behind what had once been Union lines, and that thought sat heavy in my mind. I stopped the car near one of the cannons I had seen on the map. It was positioned just outside a thick patch of trees and brush, aimed toward where Confederate lines once were. I parked, shut off the engine, and the sudden quiet made my ears ring. I stepped out and felt the heat hit me even harder. There was no breeze. The air smelled like dry grass, dirt, and old leaves baking in the sun. The cannon itself was dark and rough, the metal warm when I got close. The wheels were cracked with age, and the ground around it was uneven, worn down by time and feet. I took out my camera, turned it on, and stepped back a few feet to frame the shot. I remember thinking how strange it was that something meant to kill people now sat calmly in a park with birds hopping nearby. When I lifted my head from the camera screen and looked toward the trees, my body locked up. My breath caught hard in my chest. Just to my right, maybe 15 feet away, I saw a man standing near the edge of the brush. He was dressed in blue. Not modern blue, but the exact shade you see in old Civil War photos. He had a rifle slung in a way that looked natural, not posed. For a split second, my brain didn't understand what I was seeing. My first thought was that it was a reenactor. That thought came fast, like my mind grabbing at anything normal. But there were no events scheduled that day, and this was the middle of the afternoon, dead quiet. The man didn't look at me. He didn't react to my presence at all. His posture was loose, almost tired, like someone who had been standing too long. Then the part that made my stomach drop happened. The light shifted, or my eyes adjusted, and I realized I could see the trees through him. Not around him. Through him. His outline was there, clear enough to register clothing and shape, but the background wasn't blocked. It was like looking at someone through a thin sheet of glass. My skin went cold despite the heat. I stood there frozen, my camera hanging useless in my hand. The man took a single step forward, slow and steady, and as he did, the shape broke apart. It didn't fade in a dramatic way. It didn't vanish in a flash. It simply stopped making sense to my eyes. 1 second there was a figure, the next there was only brush, shadow, and sunlight. I stayed perfectly still for a long moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I scanned the trees, the ground, the space where he had been. There was nothing. No sound of footsteps, no movement of branches. Just cicadas buzzing somewhere deeper in the woods. I backed away from the cannon and returned to my car, my hands shaking as I opened the door. I sat inside with the engine off, staring through the windshield. I needed to ground myself, to slow my breathing. I told myself there had to be a real reason. Heat does strange things. Light bends. Shadows overlap. The battlefield was full of statues, cutouts, and markers. My eyes could have lined up shapes in a way that tricked me. Still, I didn't trust my memory alone. I pulled out my iPhone and started recording notes. I spoke every detail I could remember, the time, the location, the position of the sun, how far away the figure was, what direction it moved. I did it because I knew I wouldn't have service later, and I didn't want the details to blur or change after the shock wore off. After a while, I turned the car back on and drove slowly away. I didn't stop again. I finished the loop through the park, but I stayed inside the car, windows up, eyes forward. The statues felt different now, less like memorials and more like watchers. Every patch of shade made my nerves tighten. That night at the hotel, once I had internet, I started researching. I looked up reenactment schedules. There were none. I read about park maintenance crews and historical demonstrations. Nothing matched the time or location. Then I read about heat shimmer and mirages, how extreme heat can bend light and make solid objects look distorted or transparent. I looked at photos of that exact cannon and realized there was a weathered sign and a partially broken statue base near the tree line that, from a certain angle, could line up just right. By the end of the night, I had a conclusion that made sense. I hadn't seen anything supernatural. I had seen a moment where exhaustion, heat, history, and environment lined up perfectly. My brain filled in the gaps with something familiar from books and photos. The fear came from not understanding it in the moment, not from anything unreal. The next morning, I went back in daylight, earlier and cooler. I stood near the same cannon and walked the ground slowly. I found the exact spot where the shadows overlapped. From that angle, for just a second, it looked like a man-shaped outline. Not clear, not solid, but close enough to fool tired eyes. I left Vicksburg later that day with a strange respect for the place. Not because it was haunted, but because it carried weight. The land remembers in quiet ways, through heat, light, and silence. What scared me wasn't a ghost. It was how easily the mind can be pushed when standing on ground soaked in history. And that was clear enough for me. I had been driving for hours that day, not on any schedule, just letting the road narrow and climb until the pavement turned to gravel and the trees started closing in. It was one of those late afternoons where the light already felt tired, even though the sun was still up. I wasn't trying to get far, just far enough to feel away from everything. My dog was in the back, curled up like she always was on trips, calm and half asleep. She had been camping with me plenty of times before and never acted strange. That was part of why what happened stuck with me so hard. I pulled off onto a rough forest road and started crawling along, windows cracked, looking for a flat enough spot to set up camp before dark. The road climbed steadily, winding around a big hill that rose above the trees. The forest was thick and dry, with tall pines and brush that smelled dusty and sharp. Everything felt quiet in a normal way at first. No wind, no birds, just that soft, empty sound you get when the woods are holding their breath. That was when my dog sat straight up. At first I thought she just heard an animal. Her ears went forward, her body stiff. Then the hair along her back started to rise. I slowed the car and looked around, expecting to see a deer cross the road or something move in the trees. Nothing did. She let out a low sound, not a bark, more like a warning under her breath. I told myself she would settle down in a minute like she always did. She didn't. I parked in a wide turnout and stepped out to stretch my legs. The moment I opened the door, she jumped out behind me and stayed pressed against my leg, staring uphill. Her tail was stiff. Her teeth were showing just slightly. She kept making that low sound, over and over. I had never seen her do that before, not once. Usually she was curious, eager, pulling at the leash. This time, she didn't want to move forward at all. I tried to walk a few steps away from the car, thinking maybe she just needed to get out of her system. She refused to follow. Her body leaned back, digging in. That was when I heard it. Voices. They sounded like men talking somewhere up the hill, not loud, but close enough that I expected to see someone any second. I stopped and listened. The words didn't make sense. It was like hearing a radio through a wall, the rhythm of speech without any clear meaning. I tilted my head, trying to focus. Nothing sharpened. The sounds faded, then came back again a few seconds later, slightly to the side this time. I looked up the slope. The hill was steep and covered in brush and trees. No trail that I could see, no clearing, nothing that explained why people would be standing there talking. I reminded myself that sound can travel weird in the mountains. I had heard that before. I told myself it was probably hikers or campers on the other side of the hill, their voices bending and bouncing around in a strange way. But my dog didn't relax. If anything, she got worse. She started pacing tight circles around my legs, stopping every few seconds to stare uphill again. The hair on her back stayed raised. Her breathing was fast. She let out another low growl that made my skin crawl because it sounded so serious. I checked my watch without really thinking about it. Only a few minutes had passed. I stood there for a long time, just listening. The voices would come and go. Every time they came back, they sounded like they were right around the corner, just out of sight. Every time I tried to lock onto a word, I couldn't. There was no laughter, no clear tone, just the shape of talking. It made my head hurt in a dull way, like my brain was working too hard on something it couldn't solve. I started walking slowly along the road, uphill, thinking I might see where the sound was coming from. My dog pulled hard in the opposite direction. She planted her feet and leaned back with her full weight. That alone was enough to stop me. She had never done that before, not even around bears. The feeling in my chest tightened. Time stretched. I don't know exactly how long we stood there, but it felt like forever. Later, I realized it had been close to 45 minutes of this back and forth. The voices appearing and disappearing, my dog never calming down. The lights started to change, turning flat and gray. Shadows deepened under the trees. At some point, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The forest itself felt wrong. Not silent, exactly, but empty in a way I couldn't explain. No birds, no insects, just the voices and the sound of my dog breathing hard. I walked back to the car and opened the door. My hands were shaking a little, which annoyed me because I hate feeling scared without a clear reason. I sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, listening one last time. The voices came back again, closer than before, right at the edge of the trees. Still no words. Still nothing visible. That was when the feeling finally broke through all the logic I was throwing at it. I didn't belong there. Whatever was going on, it wasn't meant for me to understand in that moment, and staying longer felt like a mistake I couldn't take back. I shut the door, started the engine, and turned the car around as fast as the narrow road would allow. As I drove away, I kept expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. No one did. The voices faded as I went downhill, swallowed by the forest. I didn't stop until I was back on a main road with real traffic and open space. Only then did my dog finally lie down, her body relaxing like someone had flipped a switch. She slept the rest of the way home. A few days later, I looked up the area out of curiosity. I found a small local article about law enforcement clearing out an illegal operation hidden in those hills, the kind that stays quiet and off maps on purpose. No details, no exact location, just enough to make my stomach tighten again. I know there are simple explanations for sound and fear and animal behavior. I know how easy it is to let imagination fill in gaps. But I also know that in all my years of camping, hiking, and being alone outdoors, I have never felt that specific kind of warning before. I listened to it that day. I left. And I have never gone back to that road because whatever was happening up that hill didn't need me there to make it real. It was one of those nights where nothing felt strange at first. Just a normal camping trip, normal people, normal plans. The kind of night where you are relaxed enough to let your guard down. That is probably why what happened stuck with me so hard afterward. Around 10 at night, my stomach turned on me. Not a warning rumble, but the kind that tells you that you have a limited amount of time to make a decision. Our campsite did not have bathrooms nearby, so I grabbed my phone for light and started walking down the main path toward the restrooms about a quarter mile away. The campground was quiet in that deep way where even your footsteps sound loud. The trees were thick on both sides, and the moon was barely doing anything. It was dark enough that my phone light felt small and weak. About halfway there, I noticed movement ahead of me. Someone stepped out from a side path that led to an unused campsite. That path was far from ours, maybe 50 yards off to the side. I could not see the face clearly, but the way the person walked stopped me cold. I knew that walk. My friend had a strange, uneven way of moving, like one leg was always half a second behind the other. It was not something you mistake easily. The figure stayed ahead of me, always a good distance away. At a few points, the person turned around and seemed to react to my presence, as if annoyed. The body language matched my friend perfectly. That was what made it so convincing. I assumed he had gone for a walk or was messing around. I remember feeling confused more than scared. Why would he be coming from an unused site? Why not just walk with me? The figure picked up speed. I tried to keep up, but the darkness swallowed him. Within seconds, he was gone. I reached the bathrooms without seeing him again. I did what I came there to do, washed my hands, and walked back feeling slightly irritated. When I got back to camp, my friend was there, relaxed, acting normal. Everyone acted like nothing had happened. When I pushed the issue, They all denied he had gone anywhere. I wrote it off as them messing with me or me being tired. It bothered me, but not enough to ruin the night. A few hours later, around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I did not want to make the long walk again, so I stepped away from the tents and went a short distance into the woods. The night felt heavier than before, colder, the kind of quiet where you feel watched even though you know that it's probably just your imagination. On my way back, I heard the sound of a tent zipper. That sound is very specific, and in the dark it carries. I could tell which tent it came from. My friend's tent. I saw a shadow sit up and then settle again. As I got closer, I saw him step out. The shape, the height, the way he stood. It was him. There was no doubt in my mind. He walked a few steps and stopped. I watched him fumble with a lighter. The brief sparks lit his face in flashes, enough to recognize it. The flame caught, and he took a drag. The glow of the cigarette made it even clearer. Same hair, same posture, same tired slouch. He looked right at me. He reacted to my presence. He even moved like he always did, that same uneven walk. Then he headed toward the parked cars. I followed, annoyed now, convinced this was just more of the same messing around. I lost him for a moment as he passed behind one of the vehicles. When I rounded the corner, he was gone. There was nowhere he could have gone without making noise. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the darkness, feeling my heart beat faster for no good reason. Finally, I went back to camp. I walked straight to his tent, expecting him to be there laughing or pretending to sleep. The tent was zipped up tight. I stood there and listened. I could hear him snoring softly inside. A steady, slow rhythm. The kind you do not fake while standing up seconds earlier. The rest of the night, I barely slept. My brain kept replaying every detail. The walk, the lighter, the way he reacted to me. In the morning, he swore he never left his tent. He had not gone for a walk. He had not smoked. He had not talked to anyone. No one else had seen him either. I did not see a ghost. I did not see anything supernatural. What I saw was something that looked exactly like my friend and behaved exactly like him. Later that day, in the light, I noticed another camper a few sites down. Same height, same build, even a similar limp from an old injury. He smoked. He walked around at night because he had trouble sleeping. It explained the shape, the gait, even the lighter. In the dark, with tired eyes and a little alcohol still in my system, my brain filled in the rest. What still bothers me is how certain I was, how real it felt, how close I was to him, the way my mind never questioned it in the moment. That night taught me how easy it is to trust your senses and how wrong they can be when conditions are bad. Darkness, distance, expectation, and familiarity can build something convincing enough to scare you without anything truly strange happening. Nothing followed me home. Nothing ever happened again. But every time I camp now, every time I see someone moving in the dark, I remember that night. I remember how sure I was. And I remind myself that fear does not need anything supernatural to exist. Sometimes all it needs is a familiar shape in the wrong place at the wrong time. I started my shift just as the sun was sinking behind the jagged peaks of the mountains. The park was quiet in that early evening, the kind of quiet that fills every corner, pressing against your ears, so you hear even the faintest rustle of wind through pine needles. I had spent years walking these trails, patrolling the campgrounds, and keeping an eye on the wildlife, but there was always something about the night that made the park feel vast and unpredictable. Tonight, it felt heavier somehow, almost like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I drove slowly along the narrow ranger road, headlights cutting through the early shadows. The asphalt was damp from an afternoon shower, and the smell of wet earth mixed with pine sap clung to the cab of my truck. As I passed the usual turnout near the creek, I noticed something unusual, a small fire ring still smoldering, though the campground had been officially closed for hours. A quick glance told me there were no tents around, no discarded trash or gear, just a faint curling smoke rising from the stones. Normally, I would have assumed someone had stayed past closing, but the way the smoke lingered, I could tell it was fresh, the kind of embers that would be hot if you reached into the ring. I made a mental note to check it later, figuring whoever had been there had left without a trace. The rest of the drive was uneventful, or so it seemed. I checked the usual spots: the trailhead by the lake, the overlook along the ridge, the backwoods loop where hikers often disappeared from cell service. All quiet. No cars, no people, no unusual animal activity, just the normal calls of birds settling in for the night and the occasional rustle of small mammals. I parked at the ranger station around 9 and started logging reports for the day, my flashlight cutting through the shadows inside the building. As I scribbled notes, I could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the tin roof. Around 10, I decided to make a foot patrol of the nearby trails. My flashlight bounced across trees, highlighting the dark green of wet needles and the rough texture of bark. The air was sharp, cold against my face, and the ground squished slightly under my boots with the residue of the earlier rain. About half a mile in, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud, narrow like a dirt bike or a small ATV, but the park strictly forbade motorized vehicles off-road. The tracks ran parallel to the trail for a short stretch before veering into the undergrowth, disappearing among the ferns and fallen branches. I followed them carefully, feeling the weight of my flashlight and the chill crawling up my spine. The tracks led me to a clearing I hadn't expected, an overgrown spot near the old ranger cabin that had been abandoned for years. The cabin was barely standing, its roof sagging and walls rotting, but something about it tonight felt oddly alive. My boots crunched over sticks as I approached, and I could see signs of recent human presence. A discarded water bottle, a torn backpack strap snagged on a bush, footprints leading in and out of the cabin. I circled the cabin slowly, making sure I wasn't surprised from behind. The place smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight, and I found the remnants of a fire, ashes still warm to the touch. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. I paused, scanning the surrounding forest. Normally, an abandoned cabin wouldn't draw my attention, but tonight, it seemed like the forest itself was holding its breath. I noted that someone had moved logs to make seating, and someone had left a backpack with a half-empty water bottle. No people, no voices, nothing, just a faint echo of recent human activity. I stayed there for a while, checking the area for anything left behind that could identify who had been here. The trail back to the road was slippery and uneven, but I managed to navigate it carefully, leaving no trace myself. By the time I returned to my truck, the wind had grown stronger, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke with it. I drove slowly back toward the ranger station, keeping an eye out for anything unusual, anything that might explain the cabin visit. By the time I reached the station, the night was deep and absolute, the kind of dark where shadows merge, and even familiar trees look unfamiliar. I logged the discovery in my report, marking the cabin and the fire as potential violations, and then I went over the day's other notes. I double-checked the maps, confirmed the campgrounds were secure, and called the night dispatch to let them know about the incident. There was nothing supernatural, nothing eerie in a fantasy sense, just human presence in a place it shouldn't have been, and the quiet tension that comes from knowing that even in a well-patrolled park, people can vanish into the wilderness and leave no trace. Finally, I stepped outside, took a deep breath of the cold night air, and watched the sky. Stars pierced the darkness, sharp and clear, reflecting off the wet canopy. I realized that the forest was just doing what it always does, waiting, observing, surviving, indifferent to human fear. And I, as a ranger, was simply there to notice, to mark, to keep records, and to make sure that when dawn came, the park was as it should be. I drove back along the empty road one last time, headlights casting long shadows, and as I reached the main entrance, I felt the weight lift. The forest had stayed still, nothing had gone wrong, and the cabin would be dealt with in the morning. It was a good night's work in the sense that nothing catastrophic had happened, and the forest, for now, was safe. By the time I finally turned off the lights at the ranger station, my boots were muddy, my jacket damp, and my notebook filled with careful observations. I knew the cabin would likely see visitors again, but I felt confident that the park would endure just as it always had. The forest was alive, but it wasn't cruel. It was simply persistent, indifferent, and resilient. And I MIS. I spent that summer working as a park ranger in a large, rugged national park that sprawled over thousands of acres of forests, rivers, and steep mountain trails. My day started early, long before the sun even thought about climbing over the horizon. The air was always cool in the mornings, crisp and scented with pine and damp earth. I drove my old, battered ranger truck down winding roads, scanning the forest edges for any signs of trouble. Illegal campers, lost hikers, or injured wildlife. Some days, it felt like I was the only person alive in the entire park. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, I set out to inspect a section of the park that bordered a dense area of conifer forests and steep ridges. The road was slick with mud, and water streamed down in little rivulets across the asphalt. Fallen branches were scattered everywhere, and I had to slow down to navigate through them carefully. I kept my radio on, listening for any alerts from the other rangers, though the static was usually louder than any actual messages. As I drove, I noticed that the forest seemed darker than usual, the trees dripping and swaying slightly from the wind that had risen overnight. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made me feel alert and cautious at the same time. By mid-morning, I arrived at a popular hiking trailhead. Normally, this spot would be bustling with early hikers, people stretching their legs after the drive up, but today it was completely empty. I parked my truck and stepped out, the mud sticking to my boots. I started my usual patrol, walking along the trail to check for damage from the storm, fallen trees, or any hazards for visitors. The path was slick, and I had to watch every step carefully. Every few minutes, I would hear the distant crack of a branch or the rush of water in the small stream that ran parallel to the trail. Halfway up the trail, I came across something unusual. A large tree had fallen across the path, and the roots were torn from the ground, leaving a deep hole in the soil. The soil was saturated and muddy, and I could see small rocks sliding down into the hole. It was a dangerous obstacle for anyone who might try to cross without noticing. I circled it, checking the stability of the ground around it, and made a mental note to mark it with hazard tape. As I continued, the trail narrowed and the forest closed in around me. The rain from the night before had left everything wet, the smell of moss and decomposing leaves strong in the air. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound behind me, something like a snapping twig. I froze and turned slowly, scanning the dense forest on either side of the trail. Nothing. Just the usual sway of branches in the wind. I continued, keeping my senses sharp, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I passed a small clearing where the sunlight barely reached, the mud squishing under my boots, and caught a glimpse of a movement near a fallen log. It was a deer, startled by my presence, bounding away into the deeper forest. I felt a surge of relief. Sometimes, nature reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt vulnerable. Further up the trail, I came to a small bridge over a creek. The water was high, flowing fast from the storm runoff. The wooden planks were slick and some were loose. I checked the structure carefully, tapping the planks with my boot to test their stability. The bridge would need repair before the next round of hikers arrived, but for now, I could cross carefully. On the other side, the trail climbed steeply, the soil loose and muddy, making every step a challenge. I moved slowly, knowing that a misstep could easily result in a twisted ankle or worse. By late afternoon, I reached the top of the ridge. The view stretched for miles, layers of green forest fading into distant blue mountains. Despite the day's tension, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why I loved the job, the quiet beauty, the sense of responsibility, the knowledge that I was helping to keep this wild place safe. I sat on a rock, catching my breath, listening to the wind in the treetops. On my way back, I took extra time to inspect the hazards I had noted. I marked the fallen tree with bright tape, flagged the unstable bridge, and recorded everything in my log. By the time I returned to my truck, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest. I drove slowly down the winding roads, aware that darkness would fall soon and the forest would look entirely different under fading light. When I finally reached the ranger station, I cleaned up, filed my reports, and checked the communications board for any updates. Everything was in order. It was a long day, exhausting but rewarding. The park was safe, the hazards noted, and I had been able to witness the raw, untamed beauty of the place I worked to protect. As I looked out the window at the last light of day, I felt a quiet pride in the work I did. It wasn't glamorous, wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. That night, I went to bed knowing I had done my job well, and that the park, vast and wild as it was, would still be there tomorrow for the hikers, the animals, and anyone seeking a moment of calm in nature. By the end of the summer, I had patrolled miles of trails, repaired dozens of hazards, and helped more hikers than I could count. Each day brought new challenges, new risks, and new rewards. The work was relentless, but I knew that the park relied on people like me to keep it safe and accessible. And as I watched the sun rise over the mountains on my final day of patrol, I felt a deep, lasting connection to the forest, the trails, and the silent, enduring rhythm of life that carried on regardless of storms, mud, or the passage of time. The park was never going to be tame, and it never needed to be. All it needed was someone who cared enough to pay attention, someone willing to walk the trails, inspect the hazards, and protect the quiet, wild heart of the place. That summer, I knew I had done exactly that. I remember the first time I realized just how unpredictable the wilderness could be, even in the daytime, and how small you are in comparison. I was working a routine patrol in a section of the park that wasn't heavily trafficked, mostly a mix of thick pine forest, uneven trails, and a few old logging roads that had long since been abandoned. The weather had been overcast all morning, and a heavy gray blanket hung over the treetops, diffusing the sunlight, so the forest floor always seemed a little dim, even at noon. I was driving slowly along one of the old gravel roads, scanning the brush for signs of animals, illegal campfires, or off-road vehicles that weren't supposed to be there. The park was big enough that you could go hours without seeing another person, which was part of what I loved about it, but also made being out there on my own something that required constant attention. That day, my route took me past a creek that cut through the middle of a small valley. The creek's water was high from recent rains, muddy in color but moving quickly, and the banks were slippery with moss and wet leaves. I parked my ranger truck near a small clearing where the trail split and got out to check a section of trail that had been reported to have fallen trees and erosion from the storm last week. I strapped on my backpack, checked my radio, and started down the narrow, leaf-covered path. The sound of the creek running behind me mixed with the occasional bird calls and the crunch of wet leaves beneath my boots. Everything was quiet except for the natural sounds of the forest, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every little movement and noise. As I walked, I noticed something odd in the undergrowth, a small set of footprints leading off the trail, partially obscured by leaves. I crouched down to examine them and realized they weren't animal tracks. They were human, small, and looked like they had been made fairly recently, maybe the day before. There was no other evidence of a person nearby, no discarded food wrappers or camping gear, but the tracks led downhill toward the creek, disappearing into the brush. It wasn't unusual for hikers to wander off trail, but this part of the park was steep and dangerous, and I knew the soil there was soft and prone to sliding. The thought of someone trying to navigate that terrain without proper equipment made my stomach tighten. I followed the tracks cautiously, moving slow enough to avoid disturbing them further. The forest was denser here, with trees crowded together and branches forming a near-continuous canopy overhead. The light was dimmer now, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I heard a distant cracking sound, like a branch snapping under weight, and froze. It could have been an animal, a deer moving through the brush, but instinct told me it could have been a person in trouble. I kept moving, but slowly, listening and watching. The tracks led to a steep drop where the creek widened into a small, fast-flowing section. The water was high, rushing past moss-covered rocks, and the banks were muddy and unstable. There was no way a person could cross here without risking injury. I circled around the creek, looking for any other sign of movement or a possible way someone could have crossed. That's when I saw it. A piece of bright red fabric caught on a low branch near the water's edge. I approached carefully and saw it was part of a jacket, torn, hanging as if it had been snagged by the branches as someone tried to move through the underbrush. My heart started pounding. It was clear now that someone had been here recently and had struggled to navigate the terrain. I radioed my station with my location and description of what I'd found. Backup was on the way, but I didn't want to leave the area. There was a chance the person might still be nearby, maybe injured, maybe lost. I began to systematically search the surrounding area, moving slowly along the creek bank and scanning the thick undergrowth. The rain from the previous week had turned the ground into a patchwork of slippery mud and hidden holes, and each step had to be deliberate. After nearly an hour, I spotted a small figure lying partially hidden in a shallow depression near a large rock. As I got closer, I realized it was a teenage boy, soaked, shivering, and exhausted. He had tried to climb down the steep slope and had fallen, scraping his arm and leg badly. I immediately assessed his injuries, checked that he was conscious and breathing, and carefully helped him back up to safer ground. I wrapped him in a thermal blanket from my backpack and gave him water. He kept thanking me quietly, and I kept checking the area around us, knowing the steep terrain and rising water could still be dangerous. It took another 30 minutes to reach a safer trail where I could carry him to my truck. My partner arrived shortly afterward, and together we got him into the vehicle. I radioed ahead to alert the station that we had the boy in good condition and that he would need further medical attention. Driving him back, I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints, the torn jacket, and the sound of the creek rushing past. It was a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be and how quickly things can go wrong. I also thought about the kid, what had made him wander off alone into that section of the park, and how lucky he had been that I had noticed the tracks and followed them. By the time we reached the ranger station, the clouds had started to break, and shafts of sunlight were glinting off wet tree leaves. The boy was checked by a medic, and after a short evaluation, he was cleared to go home with a warning and instructions not to wander alone in difficult terrain. I filed my report, noting every detail, the location, the footprints, the jacket, the injuries, and the time it took to find him. Later, as I cleaned my gear and looked out at the forest, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The forest was still wild, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous, but it had also given me a chance to help someone in real need. That day reminded me that even on routine patrols, every sound, every sign, and every instinct could matter. And as I locked up the station for the night, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing I had done exactly what being a ranger was about. Watching over the forest and the people who entered it, ready for whatever could happen. I've been a park ranger for over 6 years, and in all that time, I've learned that nature has a quiet, unforgiving way of reminding you who's in charge. Last summer, I was assigned to patrol a remote section of a national park that few visitors ever reached. The trail was narrow, winding through dense pine and fir, with steep ridges on one side and sheer drops on the other. It was the kind of place where you had to pay attention to every step, every sound, because a single misstep could be disastrous. I started my shift just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. The air was cool but heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I had my usual gear, a sturdy flashlight, a radio, a first aid kit, and my rifle, more for precaution than actual need. Wildlife was common, and encounters could be dangerous if you weren't careful. Bears had been spotted earlier in the season, and there were reports of a few mountain lions in the area. Not that I expected trouble, but I never underestimated the wilderness. As I hiked deeper into the trail, I noticed the wind picking up, rustling the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispers. It made me uneasy, though I tried to ignore it. I had walked this path many times before, but this evening felt different. The light was fading faster than usual, and the shadows seemed to stretch across the trail, hiding hollows and uneven ground. I slowed my pace, keeping my eyes on the trail, and listened for any unusual noises. After about an hour, I came across the first sign that something wasn't quite right. A small group of deer tracks led across the trail, but they were erratic, like the animals had been startled and scattered in all directions. That wasn't uncommon, but what caught my attention was the lack of other signs. No bird calls, no rustling of smaller animals in the underbrush, nothing. The forest felt suspended, as if it were holding its breath. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and moved forward cautiously. About 30 minutes later, I reached a clearing where an old ranger cabin once stood. It had burned down years ago, leaving only a blackened stone foundation and scattered remnants of wood. Normally, I would have used it as a brief rest point, but tonight I paused at a distance. The clearing was completely silent, except for the sound of my boots on the dry needles and leaves. Then I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the dirt. A vehicle had been here recently. That was strange because the area was officially closed to vehicles, and the trail leading here was barely wide enough for a Jeep. I crouched down to examine the tracks, shining my flashlight along the grooves. The mud was soft, suggesting the vehicle had passed within the last day, maybe even the last few hours. Whoever had been here wasn't supposed to be, and that put me on edge. I radioed the main station to report it, keeping my voice low so as not to carry too far. They confirmed the trail had been closed for weeks due to erosion and hazardous conditions, and they asked me to keep an eye out for trespassers. As night fully settled in, I continued along the trail. The forest grew darker, the trees forming black silhouettes against the sky. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating roots, rocks, and fallen branches. I kept seeing flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye, but each time I turned, nothing was there. My heart rate increased, not from fear exactly, but from the acute awareness that in a place like this, you were always exposed. Several miles in, I came across a narrow ridge trail that overlooked a small river valley. The river glinted faintly in the moonlight, and I could hear the water rushing over rocks far below. I paused to catch my breath and check my map, making sure I hadn't veered off course. That's when I noticed something glinting near the edge of the trail, a small metal object half buried in the dirt. I knelt down and realized it was a dropped flashlight, likely from whoever had driven their vehicle here earlier. It was scratched, dirted, and the batteries were dead, but it confirmed I wasn't alone in the area tonight. I continued carefully, keeping my senses sharp. About a mile later, I saw the vehicle tracks again, leading to a collapsed section of trail. The trail gave way to a steep incline, and the tires had cut through loose soil, creating a minor landslide. I radioed the station again, explaining the situation and requesting that maintenance crews inspect the damage in daylight. While I waited for confirmation that my message had been received, I stayed vigilant, scanning the tree line for any sign of people. Eventually, the radio crackled back, confirming that the crews would be dispatched first thing in the morning. The relief I felt was quiet but profound. I still had several miles to hike back to my post, and I didn't want to linger in the dark more than necessary. I maintained a steady pace, alert to every sound, every movement, until the trail gradually led me back to the main access road. By the time I reached the parking area, dawn was just beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The forest had lost its oppressive weight, replaced by the calm, reassuring presence of morning. I reported in one final time and noted the locations of the vehicle tracks and damaged trail. When the maintenance crews arrived later that day, they confirmed my observations and began clearing debris and repairing the washout. That night reminded me why I became a park ranger in the first place. Not for adventure or danger, but to protect these spaces and the people who might wander into them unaware. It also reminded me that even in familiar territory, the wilderness demands respect, awareness, and patience. I left the park that evening tired but satisfied, knowing that the trail would be safe again and that my work had made a real difference. I have worked as a park ranger for over 10 years, mostly in the northern forests where the terrain is rugged and the winters are long and harsh. Being a ranger is not just a job, it's a lifestyle. Every day, I'm surrounded by the wild, by the quiet and the noise that the forest makes. Creeks that ripple under the ice, branches that snap under the weight of snow, the distant calls of animals whose names I know but rarely see. I have had some close calls, some tense moments, but the one night I will never forget started like any other quiet patrol and ended with me feeling a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and respect for how quickly the forest can turn from peaceful to dangerous. It was late October, and the first snow had already fallen, leaving the forest floor covered in a thin, powdery layer of white. I had spent the day checking the trails, clearing debris from the paths, and making sure the trailheads were all in proper condition for the hikers who would arrive in the following days. The park was relatively empty at this time of year, which made the nights quiet, almost too quiet. I had my standard gear with me, a flashlight, a radio, a first aid kit, and a rifle. Not that I expected to use it, but the animals in this park were unpredictable, especially as winter approached. That night, I was driving my patrol truck along a narrow, winding service road that cut through the densest part of the forest. The trees were so tall and thick that even under the full moon, the road felt dark, as though the forest itself was closing in around me. I had my headlights on, but they barely penetrated the shadows. I was listening to the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of my radio when I noticed something unusual, a small plume of smoke rising in the distance, just beyond a bend in the road. At first, I thought it was a campfire from a hiker who had ignored the seasonal restrictions, but as I got closer, I realized the smoke was thin, wispy, and spreading unnaturally across the low branches. Something didn't feel right. I pulled the truck off to the side and switched off the engine, letting the silence of the forest surround me. My ears tuned to the subtle sounds, the wind pushing through the treetops, the crunch of snow under a distant animal's foot, and that faint hissing of smoke. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold biting through my jacket, and walked toward the source of the smoke, moving carefully over roots and ice. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became, and that's when I realized it wasn't a campfire at all. It was electrical. The smell of melted plastic and ozone hung in the air. I scanned the area with my flashlight and finally saw it. A utility box, one of the old transformers that supplied power to the ranger stations and trail headlights, was sparking and smoking. The metal casing was warped, and small flames were licking the sides of the box. If it caught properly, it could start a forest fire, and in this dry, early winter forest, that was a terrifying prospect. I radioed the station immediately to report the emergency and asked for the fire suppression team. While I waited, I had to make sure the fire didn't spread, so I carefully used my boots to clear away the dry leaves and pine needles surrounding the box, creating a small barrier. Sparks were flying, and I could hear the faint pop of metal heating and snapping under the stress. My heart was racing, but my hand stayed steady. I knew panicking would not help, and any mistake could make things worse. Within 10 minutes, the fire crew arrived. They brought extinguishers, water, and fire retardant blankets. Together, we worked methodically, smothering the flames and cooling the metal to prevent another flare-up. By the time the fire was fully out, the forest had fallen silent again, save for the sound of our boots and the distant howl of a coyote. The danger had passed, and no trees were damaged, but I felt the weight of what could have happened if I had been a few minutes later, if the fire had grown just a little before we arrived. After everything was under control, I took a moment to walk back along the service road. The cold air stung my lungs, and my fingers were red and numb from the chill, but I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. That night reminded me why being a ranger is as much about vigilance as it is about maintenance, knowledge, and patience. It reminded me that the forest is beautiful, but it is also mercilessly indifferent to human mistakes. By the time I returned to the station, the first snow had started falling again, and I stood there watching the flakes drift down onto the quiet trees. There were no dramatic stories of confrontation, no mysterious noises, no fantastical creatures, just reality. Real danger, real preparation, and real responsibility. I logged the incident, double-checked my gear, and made a note to inspect all the other Transformers in the park. I knew I had prevented a potential disaster, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was enough. The forest was safe, at least for that night, and I had done my job. In the end, that night didn't make me a hero. It didn't make me famous or even remarkable in anyone's eyes except my own. But it reinforced why I chose this work. To be present in the forest, to understand it, to anticipate its threats, and to protect it from harm as best I could. Walking back to my truck in the snow, feeling the cold seep into my bones, but also the satisfaction in my chest, I knew that moments like this, quiet, tense, and real, were exactly why I was a park ranger. I spent that summer working as a park ranger in a large, rugged national park that sprawled over thousands of acres of forests, rivers, and steep mountain trails. My days started early, long before the sun even thought about climbing over the horizon. The air was always cool in the mornings, crisp and scented with pine and damp earth. I drove my old, battered ranger truck down winding roads, scanning the forest edges for any signs of trouble. Illegal campers, lost hikers, or injured wildlife. Some days, it felt like I was the only person alive in the entire park. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, I set out to inspect a section of the park that bordered a dense area of conifer forests and steep ridges. The road was slick with mud, and water streamed down in little rivulets across the asphalt. Fallen branches were scattered everywhere, and I had to slow down to navigate through them carefully. I kept my radio on, listening for any alerts from the other rangers, though the static was usually louder than any actual messages. As I drove, I noticed that the forest seemed darker than usual, the trees dripping and swaying slightly from the wind that had risen overnight. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made me feel alert and cautious at the same time. By mid-morning, I arrived at a popular hiking trailhead. Normally, this spot would be bustling with early hikers, people stretching their legs after the drive up. But today, it was completely empty. I parked my truck and stepped out, the mud sticking to my boots. I started my usual patrol, walking along the trail to check for damage from the storm, fallen trees, or any hazards for visitors. The path was slick, and I had to watch every step carefully. Every few minutes, I would hear the distant crack of a branch or the rush of water in the small stream that ran parallel to the trail. Halfway up the trail, I came across something unusual. A large tree had fallen across the path, and the roots were torn from the ground, leaving a deep hole in the soil. The soil was saturated and muddy, and I could see small rocks sliding down into the hole. It was a dangerous obstacle for anyone who might try to cross without noticing. I circled it, checking the stability of the ground around it, and made a mental note to mark it with hazard tape. As I continued, the trail narrowed, and the forest closed in around me. The rain from the night before had left everything wet, the smell of moss and decomposing leaves strong in the air. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound behind me, something like a snapping twig. I froze and turned slowly, scanning the dense forest on either side of the trail. Nothing. Just the usual sway of branches in the wind. I continued, keeping my senses sharp, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I passed a small clearing where the sunlight barely reached, the mud squishing under my boots, and caught a glimpse of a movement near a fallen log. It was a deer, startled by my presence, bounding away into the deeper forest. I felt a surge of relief. Sometimes, nature reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt vulnerable. Further up the trail, I came to a small bridge over a creek. The water was high, flowing fast from a storm runoff. The wooden planks were slick and some were loose. I checked the structure carefully, tapping the planks with my boot to test their stability. The bridge would need repair before the next round of hikers arrived, but for now, I could cross carefully. On the other side, the trail climbed steeply, the soil loose and muddy, making every step a challenge. I moved slowly, knowing that a misstep could easily result in a twisted ankle or worse. By late afternoon, I reached the top of the ridge. The view stretched for miles, layers of green forest fading into distant blue mountains. Despite the day's tension, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why I loved the job. The quiet beauty, the sense of responsibility, the knowledge that I was helping to keep this wild place safe. I sat on a rock, catching my breath, listening to the wind in the treetops. On my way back, I took extra time to inspect the hazards I had noted. I marked the fallen tree with bright tape, flagged the unstable bridge, and recorded everything in my log. By the time I returned to my truck, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest. I drove slowly down the winding roads, aware that darkness would fall soon and the forest would look entirely different under fading light. When I finally reached the ranger station, I cleaned up, filed my reports, and checked the communications board for any updates. Everything was in order. It was a long day, exhausting but rewarding. The park was safe, the hazards noted, and I had been able to witness the raw, untamed beauty of the place I worked to protect. As I looked out the window at the last light of day, I felt a quiet pride in the work I did. It wasn't glamorous, wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. That night, I went to bed knowing I had done my job well, and that the park, vast and wild as it was, would still be there tomorrow for the hikers, the animals, and anyone seeking a moment of calm in nature. By the end of the summer, I had patrolled miles of trails, repaired dozens of hazards, and helped more hikers than I could count. Each day brought new challenges, new risks, and new rewards. The work was relentless, but I knew that the park relied on people like me to keep it safe and accessible. And as I watched the sun rise over the mountains on my final day of patrol, I felt a deep, lasting connection to the forest, the trails, and the silent, enduring rhythm of life that carried on regardless of storms, mud, or the passage of time. The park was never going to be tame, and it never needed to be. All it needed was someone who cared enough to pay attention, someone willing to walk the trails, inspect the hazards, and protect the quiet, wild heart of the place. That summer, I knew I had done exactly that. I had been working as a park ranger for almost 6 years, and by that time, I had become intimately familiar with the trails, the wildlife, and the subtle shifts in the forest that most visitors never noticed. Early spring was one of my favorite times of the year. The snow was just starting to melt in the higher elevations. Streams were rushing with fresh meltwater, and the air carried that crisp, clean scent of wet pine and earth. That morning, I set out on my usual patrol, driving my old, beat-up Ford truck along the narrow dirt roads that wound through the backcountry. The sun was just coming up over the ridge, spilling gold across the treetops, and the forest seemed almost alive in a way it never did in the heat of summer. I had a routine route, checking trailheads, making sure gates were secured, inspecting fire pits for leftover embers, and keeping an eye out for anyone who might have wandered off the marked trails. My job wasn't glamorous, but it required patience and attention to detail. That day, I was headed to a lesser-used trail that led up to a small alpine lake. Few people made it this far. Most of the park's visitors stuck to the main trails near the parking lots. That made it quiet, peaceful, but also a little unpredictable. The first few hours passed without incident. I stopped at an old wooden bridge that crossed a narrow creek, checking the planks for rot and making mental notes about which ones would need replacing before the summer rush. The water ran clear and cold underneath, and a few trout could be seen darting back and forth beneath the surface. I always like to pause at spots like that, just to watch the wildlife and remind myself why I did this job. A few miles further up the road, I noticed tire tracks in the mud near a small pull-off. They were fresh, maybe a day or two old, and led down the overgrown trail that ran parallel to the lake. I stopped and examined them closely. The tracks were from a small SUV, but what caught my attention was that they wandered off the trail in a way that suggested someone had been trying to get closer to the lake without following the path. That raised a red flag. In this park, off-trail driving was strictly prohibited, partly because it damaged the delicate soil and plant life, and partly because it could lead to accidents in rough terrain. I followed the tracks, slowly on foot, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. The forest here was dense, the canopy thick enough that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the ground. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the smell of damp earth was strong. After about half a mile, I found what I had been looking for. A small clearing opened up, and at the center, a vehicle was stuck in the mud. Its tires were spinning uselessly, leaving deep ruts. There was no one in sight, which made me uneasy. Vehicles didn't get stuck here by accident, especially this far back, and someone being alone this far into the backcountry was a serious safety concern. I radioed into the ranger station, describing the location and situation, and asked for backup in case someone was injured or needed assistance. While I waited, I approached the vehicle carefully, noting that the doors were unlocked, but there was no sign of anyone inside. The engine was cold. It struck me that the person had likely tried to continue on foot after getting stuck, and my mind immediately went to the potential dangers: exposure, uneven terrain, and wild animals. I knew the trails in this area could be deceptive, with sudden drop-offs hidden behind dense foliage. I began walking in the direction the tire tracks indicated the driver had gone. The forest grew thicker, the ground wetter, and the trail less distinguishable. I had to be careful with each step. A misstep could twist an ankle or worse. I followed footprints in the mud and soft earth, noting that they weren't alone. There were other impressions, likely from boots or shoes, and they seemed to double back in a confusing pattern. It was as though whoever was out here had become disoriented. After nearly an hour, I finally spotted a figure up ahead. It was a middle-aged man, leaning against a tree, looking exhausted. He had been attempting to find a shortcut back to the main trail and had gotten lost in the process. He looked relieved when he saw me and immediately tried to explain through gestures and ragged breathing that he had wandered for hours, unsure which way to go. I didn't need words. His condition told me everything. He was dehydrated, his clothes were muddy, and his face was streaked with sweat and dirt. I guided him carefully back toward the stuck vehicle, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was unforgiving to anyone who didn't respect it. When we reached the SUV, he collapsed into the driver's seat with a mix of relief and exhaustion. I radioed for a vehicle to tow it out, and within another half hour, we were back on the main road, heading toward the ranger station. At the station, I made sure he had water, a blanket, and a chance to rest before arranging for him to be escorted back to the park entrance. I filed the incident report, noting the potential hazards, the location of the vehicle, and the condition of the visitor. It was one of those days that reminded me why park safety protocols existed and why the job required constant vigilance. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had prevented a minor incident from turning into a major emergency. By the time I finished my paperwork, the sun was setting behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the valley. The forest was calm again, almost peaceful, and I could hear the distant rushing of streams mixing with the calls of evening birds. I drove back to the ranger station slowly, taking a moment to appreciate the stillness. The park was beautiful, dangerous, and unpredictable, but it was also a place where careful attention and preparedness could make the difference between disaster and safety. That day reinforced why I loved being a park ranger. It wasn't the glamour, the fame, or even the wilderness itself. It was being there, ready, and knowing that someone's safety depended on the diligence I brought to every step of the trail. / I had been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, mostly patrolling the mountainous forests of the northern region. My shifts were long, sometimes grueling, and often monotonous, but there was always a tension underlying them, a sense that nature had its own rules, and that one mistake could turn a day from ordinary to dangerous in seconds. That spring, the snow had retreated unusually late, leaving patches of slush on the trails and swollen streams from the melting snowpack. The air still carried that sharp, biting edge, and the ground was soft and muddy underfoot. One morning, I set out on my usual patrol through one of the more remote areas, a winding stretch of forest that led to a small plateau overlooking a frozen lake that had not fully thawed. The trail was narrow, lined with dense pines that blocked most of the week's sunlight. As I walked, I noticed tracks in the mud. They weren't fresh, but recent enough that someone or something had been through the area in the last day or two. Most were human footprints, boots, likely from hikers or hunters, but some were unusual, wider and heavier like animal prints, yet not perfectly formed like a bear's. I noted them mentally, marking a mental path for follow-up later in my vehicle. By mid-afternoon, the sun was low and the forest was already stretching long shadows across the trail. I decided to head back toward the ranger station, taking a detour along a ridge I hadn't patrolled in weeks. The ridge offered a panoramic view of the valley below, but the trail was rocky, uneven, and bordered by steep drops. I moved cautiously, testing every step on loose stones. Suddenly, I noticed something odd near a cluster of fir trees. A small, abandoned campsite lay partially hidden under branches. A fire pit had cooled completely, but smoke stains and scattered ash indicated it had been used recently. A few empty cans and a torn tent flap fluttered weakly in the wind. Nothing looked valuable or dangerous, but it was clear someone had left in a hurry. Curiosity and duty pushed me closer. I examined the tent remains, noting its partial collapse, probably from wind or careless packing. The cans were scattered, some crushed under tree roots or stones. It looked like whoever had been here hadn't planned to return, or maybe had been forced to leave quickly. I took photos for the report and moved on, but a feeling of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something had been watching the area recently, just out of sight. Descending the ridge, the forest grew denser, and I felt the mud and debris slowing my pace. I reached a small creek that cut across the trail. The water was cold and fast, carrying broken twigs and sediment from upstream. I carefully stepped over it, testing each stone. My boots wet almost instantly. As I lifted my head, I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, too quick to be a human, too deliberate to be random wind. I froze, listening, scanning the dense underbrush, my senses sharpening. Nothing moved again. I continued walking, but now I was hyper-aware. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, felt amplified. By the time I reached my vehicle, parked on a dirt service road below, the sun had dipped entirely, leaving only a faint red glow on the horizon. The road itself was rough, full of potholes and scattered rocks from spring runoff, and I drove slowly, headlights cutting through the dark. About 15 minutes from the ranger station, I noticed something blocking the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch, but as I got closer, I realized it was a large fallen tree, ripped from the ground by the recent thaw and wind. Its roots twisted upward, leaving a jagged mess. I had to stop, then think carefully. I couldn't risk driving over it. I grabbed my chainsaw from the back of the truck, secured the gloves, and started cutting a path large enough to drive through. The chainsaw roared, oil and sawdust spraying as I worked methodically. It took nearly 20 minutes, but finally, I cleared enough space to continue. The rest of the drive back to the station was uneventful, though I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. There were no other vehicles, no lights, just the quiet hum of my engine and the occasional splash of water from potholes. Once back, I filed my report detailing the tracks, the abandoned campsite, and the fallen tree blocking the road. The report would be used for trail maintenance and to inform other rangers in the area to check for illegal campers or hikers who might be lost. That night, after my shift ended, I sat in the station kitchen, eating a late dinner while reviewing maps and notes. I felt tired, the kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from a long day of alert vigilance. But I also felt satisfied. Nothing supernatural had occurred, nothing mysterious in a fantastical sense. What had made the day intense was real life. Nature's unpredictability, human carelessness, and the constant awareness that working in the forest requires both patience and respect. I knew tomorrow would bring more patrols, more unexpected challenges, and perhaps more mysteries, but all grounded in the reality of the work. By the end of the night, I shut down the lights, locked the doors, and looked out the window at the dark forest beyond. The wind stirred the treetops, and the distant sound of the creek hummed quietly. I realized that this is what I loved about the job, the unpredictability, the responsibility, and the satisfaction of keeping the forest safe and understood. It was tiring work, sometimes frightening, but ultimately deeply rewarding. I went to bed knowing I had done my part, and that whatever came next, I would face it as a ranger, grounded in reality and ready for whatever the forest would throw my way. I've been a park ranger for over 10 years, and most of the time, my days are a mix of long drives on gravel roads, checking campsites, and keeping an eye out for wildlife or hikers who might have gotten lost. But there are days that stick with you, the kind that make your stomach tighten and your mind replay every second long after your shift ends. One of those days started like any other, with the chill of early morning crawling through the ranger station and the smell of pine needles lingering in the air. I was scheduled to patrol the northern edge of the park, an area where the trailheads thin out and the forest becomes dense. It's a beautiful place, but it's also isolated, the kind of area where people can wander off and disappear if they're not careful. I started my morning checking the trail reports. Nothing unusual had been reported, though there was a notice about some minor rock slides near the old service road. By mid-morning, I was in my truck, the engine low and steady as I followed the winding road north. The trees arched over the path, casting dark shadows even though the sun was high. I stopped a few times to check the trailheads, making notes on a clipboard and taking photos where the rocks had shifted or trees had fallen. Everything seemed ordinary. That was the thing about this job. It's usually calm, and any small disruption, an overturned sign, a forgotten water bottle, becomes something you have to deal with. I had just finished inspecting the trail near the old fire lookout when I noticed tire tracks on a small dirt side path I hadn't seen before. They were fresh, deep, and seemed out of place. This section of the park rarely gets visitors, especially vehicles. I parked my truck and followed the tracks on foot, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves. The air felt heavier the farther I went, like the forest itself was closing in. Birds and small animals made noise, but nothing else moved. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes each footstep feel louder than it should. The tracks led me to a small clearing where the forest thinned slightly. At first, there was nothing unusual, just a patch of grass and a few scattered stones. Then I saw it, an abandoned backpack lying next to a shallow ditch. It looked recent. The straps were still clean, the fabric not yet faded by sun or rain. I knelt beside it and opened the main compartment. Inside were a water bottle, a pair of hiking boots, and a folded jacket. No identification, no food, no map. Nothing that could tell me who had left it there. I scanned the surrounding trees, listening. Nothing. The wind rustled the branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching. My training kicked in. I knew I had to report this immediately, but there was also the possibility that the person was just nearby, lost, or injured. I took photos of the backpack, its position, and the tracks, then called it in to the station. They advised me to stay put until backup arrived. While waiting, I did a slow circle around the clearing, looking for signs, broken branches, footprints, anything that could tell me more. That's when I noticed a trail of blood drops leading toward a dense thicket on the far side of the clearing. My heart rate picked up. I stayed low and followed it, careful not to make too much noise. The drops stopped at the base of a large pine tree. I crouched and saw faint scratches on the bark and a piece of torn fabric stuck in the grooves. Whoever had been here had struggled, and I knew immediately this wasn't just someone wandering off. This was serious. I radioed in my exact location and situation, describing the blood and the fabric. They told me to hold my position until a team arrived. Minutes felt like hours. I stayed alert, scanning the tree line and the forest floor. Then I noticed a faint shape moving further into the woods. Not a deer or a raccoon, but a person. I couldn't see details, just a dark silhouette slipping between the trees. I didn't move or call out. Instead, I marked the direction and waited. Soon, the backup team arrived, 3 rangers including my supervisor, all geared up with radios, flashlights, and first aid kits. We approached the area together, following the blood trail and the faint tire marks. After a tense, careful search, We found the person collapsed near a fallen log, barely conscious. They had twisted their ankle and cut themselves on a rock while trying to climb down a steep incline. No foul play, no attacker, just a hiker who had taken a wrong turn and ended up stranded. I breathed a quiet sigh of relief. We stabilized them, gave water, wrapped the ankle, and called for a vehicle to transport them back to the main road. The rescue took several hours, moving slowly to avoid further injury. By the time we returned to the station, night had fallen, and the forest was completely dark, the only lights the flashing headlights of the truck and our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the black. I sat in the driver's seat, tired and stiff, watching the forest settle into silence again. There's a calm after something like that, a sense of order restored. The hiker was safe, the park quiet, and I felt the weight of responsibility lift just slightly. That night, as I locked the station doors and hung up my coat, I thought about how easy it is for someone to get lost in the wilderness, how quickly ordinary mistakes can become dangerous. I also thought about why I do this job, the responsibility, the solitude, the chance to protect people and the land they love. Some days it's routine, some days it's tense, frightening, and exhausting. But every time someone walks away safe, every time the forest doesn't take someone unawares, I remember why I became a park ranger. It's not about adventure or heroics. It's about paying attention, being patient, and making sure people come home. That night, the forest was dark and quiet again, and I felt a simple, solid satisfaction knowing we had done exactly that. I spent that summer working as a park ranger in a large, rugged national park that sprawled over thousands of acres of forests, rivers, and steep mountain trails. My days started early, long before the sun even thought about climbing over the horizon. The air was always cool in the mornings, crisp and scented with pine and damp earth. I drove my old, battered ranger truck down winding roads, scanning the forest edges for any signs of trouble. Illegal campers, lost hikers, or injured wildlife. Some days, it felt like I was the only person alive in the entire park. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, I set out to inspect a section of the park that bordered a dense area of conifer forests and steep ridges. The road was slick with mud, and water streamed down in little rivulets across the asphalt. Fallen branches were scattered everywhere, and I had to slow down to navigate through them carefully. I kept my radio on, listening for any alerts from the other rangers, though the static was usually louder than any actual messages. As I drove, I noticed that the forest seemed darker than usual, the trees dripping and swaying slightly from the wind that had risen overnight. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made me feel alert and cautious at the same time. By mid-morning, I arrived at a popular hiking trailhead. Normally, this spot would be bustling with early hikers, people stretching their legs after the drive up, but today it was completely empty. I parked my truck and stepped out, the mud sticking to my boots. I started my usual patrol, walking along the trail to check for damage from the storm, fallen trees, or any hazards for visitors. The path was slick, and I had to watch every step carefully. Every few minutes, I would hear the distant crack of a branch or the rush of water in the small stream that ran parallel to the trail. Halfway up the trail, I came across something unusual. A large tree had fallen across the path, and the roots were torn from the ground, leaving a deep hole in the soil. The soil was saturated and muddy, and I could see small rocks sliding down into the hole. It was a dangerous obstacle for anyone who might try to cross without noticing. I circled it, checking the stability of the ground around it, and made a mental note to mark it with hazard tape. As I continued, the trail narrowed and the forest closed in around me. The rain from the night before had left everything wet, the smell of moss and decomposing leaves strong in the air. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound behind me, something like a snapping twig. I froze and turned slowly, scanning the dense forest on either side of the trail. Nothing. Just the usual sway of branches in the wind. I continued, keeping my senses sharp, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I passed a small clearing where the sunlight barely reached, the mud squishing under my boots, and caught a glimpse of a movement near a fallen log. It was a deer, startled by my presence, bounding away into the deeper forest. I felt a surge of relief. Sometimes, nature reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt vulnerable. Further up the trail, I came to a small bridge over a creek. The water was high, flowing fast from the storm runoff. The wooden planks were slick and some were loose. I checked the structure carefully, tapping the planks with my boot to test their stability. The bridge would need repair before the next round of hikers arrived, but for now, I could cross carefully. On the other side, the trail climbed steeply, the soil loose and muddy, making every step a challenge. I moved slowly, knowing that a misstep could easily result in a twisted ankle or worse. By late afternoon, I reached the top of the ridge. The view stretched for miles, layers of green forest fading into distant blue mountains. Despite the day's tension, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why I loved the job. The quiet beauty, the sense of responsibility, the knowledge that I was helping to keep this wild place safe. I sat on a rock, catching my breath, listening to the wind in the treetops. On my way back, I took extra time to inspect the hazards I had noted. I marked the fallen tree with bright tape, flagged the unstable bridge, and recorded everything in my log. By the time I returned to my truck, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest. I drove slowly down the winding roads, aware that darkness would fall soon and the forest would look entirely different under fading light. When I finally reached the ranger station, I cleaned up, filed my reports, and checked the communications board for any updates. Everything was in order. It was a long day, exhausting but rewarding. The park was safe, the hazards noted, and I had been able to witness the raw, untamed beauty of the place I worked to protect. As I looked out the window at the last light of day, I felt a quiet pride in the work I did. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. That night, I went to bed knowing I'd done my job well, and that the park, vast and wild as it was, would still be there tomorrow for the hikers, the animals, and anyone seeking a moment of calm in nature. By the end of the summer, I had patrolled miles of trails, repaired dozens of hazards, and helped more hikers than I could count. Each day brought new challenges, new risks, and new rewards. The work was relentless, but I knew that the park relied on people like me to keep it safe and accessible. And as I watched the sun rise over the mountains on my final day of patrol, I felt a deep, lasting connection to the forest, the trails, and the silent, enduring rhythm of life that carried on regardless of storms, mud, or the passage of time. The park was never going to be tame, and it never needed to be. All it needed was someone who cared enough to pay attention, someone willing to walk the trails, inspect the hazards, and protect the quiet, wild heart of the place. That summer, I knew I had done exactly that. I started my shift just before sunset, the air already carrying the faint chill of early autumn. The forest was alive with the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves, the kind of smell that seeps into your boots and lingers on your clothes for hours. The winding roads of the park were nearly empty, a few scattered hikers and bikers lingering near the parking areas, but the deeper trails were already quieting down. As a park ranger, most of my work happened during these hours, the transition from day to night, when the forest feels most alive and most unpredictable. That evening, my patrol started at the main ranger station. I checked the logs from the day, noting minor incidents. A bear sighting near the North Trail, a lost hiker who had been safely guided back to the parking lot, and a few reports of broken trail signs. Nothing unusual, at least nothing I couldn't handle with a routine drive through the park. I loaded my truck with the standard gear: flashlight, first aid kit, radio, and a set of maps. I always carried extra water and snacks. Sometimes, you never knew when you'd get stuck somewhere waiting for backup. The first part of the drive was calm. The road curved along a ridge, giving glimpses of the valley below. The sun had dipped, leaving behind a faint orange glow that slowly faded into deep blue. I noticed how quickly darkness fell in the forest compared to the open roads outside. Shadows moved between the trees, shapes that seemed alive at first glance, but were just the trunks and branches swaying with the wind. I kept my headlights low, careful not to disturb wildlife. About 20 minutes in, I saw something unusual. A set of tire tracks veered off the main road onto a small dirt trail I didn't remember seeing on the map. It was narrow, overgrown, and clearly hadn't been used much. The tracks were fresh, mud still clinging to the tires, and led deeper into the forest. My gut told me I should investigate. As a ranger, you learn to trust those instincts. I switched the truck to four-wheel drive and followed the trail, keeping my speed slow. The air smelled stronger here, earthier, with a faint hint of pine sap. The trail led to an abandoned cabin. It was small, wooden, and had clearly been empty for years. The roof sagged, shingles were missing, and the windows were dark. I parked a safe distance away and stepped out, boots crunching on the fallen leaves. I scanned the area. There was no one in sight, no fresh footprints apart from the tire tracks. The cabin looked untouched for years, yet the tracks suggested someone had been here recently. I circled the perimeter carefully, noting signs of recent activity. A fire pit cleared of leaves, empty water bottles, and a few small bags left outside. Whoever had been here wasn't trying to hide. They were just using the place and moving on quickly. I made a note to report it, but I didn't see any immediate danger. My job wasn't to make arrests. It was to protect the park and its visitors. Still, the place gave me an uneasy feeling. I decided to take a quick look inside, flashlight in hand. The cabin smelled of damp wood and dirt. Dust covered everything, but there were clear signs someone had moved through recently. Scraps of food, a half-broken chair, a blanket that looked recently folded. Nothing alarming. No weapons, no signs of violent activity, just human presence in a place that should have been abandoned. I left it at that and returned to my truck, deciding to continue my patrol and check back with the station. As I drove deeper into the park, darkness had fully settled. The forest seemed alive in a way it didn't during the day. Owls called intermittently. The rustle of leaves suggested small animals moving unseen. I passed a stream where the moon reflected off the water in a thin silver line. I slowed, listening to the night. This part of the park was remote. Cell signal was weak here, but I kept my radio on just in case. About an hour later, I received a call from another ranger. A hiker had reported seeing someone camping in the backcountry, but it wasn't on any of the official campsites. I realized it was probably the same person or group from the cabin. We coordinated over the radio, and I drove toward the last known location. When I arrived, there was no one around. The site had minimal traces of a temporary stay, footprints leading toward the river, a small pile of trash left behind. I documented everything carefully. By the time I returned to the station, it was nearly midnight. I filed a report, noting the cabin, the fresh tire tracks, and the makeshift campsite. My supervisor advised we would increase patrols in that section, but since there was no immediate danger, it wasn't considered an emergency. I spent the rest of the night driving the main roads, keeping an eye out for any unusual activity, watching deer cross silently, and listening to the wind through the pines. When morning came, the park was quiet and calm again, sunlight breaking through the trees, birds singing as if the night's activity had never happened. The previous night felt like a shadowy memory, a reminder of how unpredictable the wilderness could be. I made a final round through the trails, checking that everything was secure. By the time I returned to the station for the day shift handoff, I felt the usual mix of fatigue and satisfaction. The forest could be dark and uncertain, but as long as you stayed vigilant and respected it, you could navigate its challenges. That week, more patrols checked the back trails, and eventually, the people using the cabin moved on. The forest returned to its usual rhythm, quiet and steady, a place of peace rather than worry. I kept the notes in a log, a record of the night, knowing that being a park ranger wasn't about adventure or heroics. It was about responsibility, observation, and making sure that the wilderness stayed safe for everyone, including those who didn't always follow the rules. And in that, there was a kind of satisfaction you didn't find anywhere else. I remember the morning like it was yesterday, though in reality, it was a whole season ago. I was starting my shift early, just as the pale light of dawn was spilling over the ridge tops. The park was still quiet, the air cool and crisp, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and pine. My truck rumbled along the gravel road, tires crunching over loose stones, and I could see my breath in the cold morning air. I had a long day ahead, checking the trails, inspecting campsites, and making sure everything was in order. The park had always been my home in the sense that I knew every curve of the road, every switchback, every hidden trailhead where hikers like to slip away from the beaten path. As I drove past the old ranger station, I noticed that the main gate was swinging slightly in the wind. It wasn't unusual for the gate to move, but something felt different. The wind didn't seem strong enough to push it that far. I made a mental note to check it later and continued toward the upper trails. By the time I reached the trailhead for Eagle Ridge, the sun had climbed a little higher, painting the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and shadow. I parked the truck, grabbed my gear, and started my patrol. The trail was quiet, almost eerily so. Normally by this time of day, I would encounter joggers, hikers, and dog walkers, but the trail seemed empty. The forest itself was alive with small sounds, leaves rustling, a distant woodpecker hammering away, a squirrel darting up a tree. But there was a strange stillness that put me on edge. I tried to push the feeling aside. I've been a ranger long enough to know that nature had moods, and sometimes you just had to walk through them. I was about a mile in when I noticed something unusual on the trail. A series of deep, fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt, heading off the main path toward a narrow, almost forgotten service road that led deeper into the forest. The tracks were too big for a regular car, maybe a truck or an ATV. I frowned. ATVs were not allowed on that part of the trail, especially because the area was designated as protected habitat for a local deer population. I made a mental note to investigate and started following the tracks carefully, keeping an eye out for wildlife and anything else unusual. As I went further, the forest became denser, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in thin shafts. The air grew cooler, damper, and I could hear the distant sound of rushing water, likely the creek that ran parallel to the service road. I moved cautiously, scanning for any signs of people or vehicles. After about half a mile, I saw the source of the tracks. A large, mud-caked truck was stuck in the soft soil near the edge of the creek. Its tires were spinning slightly, having dug deep ruts in the ground, and the vehicle looked abandoned. No one was around, no footprints leading away from it, just a faint sound of water and the occasional bird calling from the treetops. I circled the truck carefully. The windows were closed and the doors were locked. Inside, I could see faint outlines of gear and supplies, but no person. I took out my radio and called it in, reporting the abandoned vehicle and its exact location. The dispatcher confirmed that a park maintenance crew would be sent to retrieve it later, but in the meantime, I was instructed to stay in the area and keep watch in case anyone returned. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher and then started its slow descent. The quiet forest felt heavier now, and I kept my senses sharp. Occasionally, a bird would fly across the trail, or the wind would shift, but nothing else appeared. I decided to do a slow perimeter check around the creek and the stuck truck, making sure the area was safe and there were no signs of illegal activity beyond what I had already found. By late afternoon, the crew had not arrived yet, and I knew I would be here for at least another hour. I sat down on a fallen log near the creek, letting my eyes rest on the water as it flowed over smooth stones, reflecting the sunlight in little flashes. I thought about how easily people underestimated the wilderness, how quickly a situation could turn dangerous. If whoever had been driving this truck had stayed longer, they could have gotten stranded for days. The park had been unforgiving like that many times before. Eventually, the maintenance crew arrived, a small group of men in high-visibility jackets, equipped with winches and tow cables. They got to work freeing the truck, carefully anchoring it and slowly pulling it back onto solid ground. I watched, feeling a sense of relief. The forest was returning to its normal rhythm, the quiet settling back into the canopy above. By the time the truck was safely on the road, I had walked back to my truck and started the drive down toward the ranger station. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest. The air had cooled again, and the distant mountains glowed with an amber hue. I thought about the solitude of my job, the responsibility I carried, and the rare moments when the forest reminded me that nature didn't care about human rules or intentions. But it also reminded me that patience, attention, and care could make all the difference between chaos and calm. By the time I reached the ranger station, everything was back in order. The gate was secured, the trails were quiet, and the park had resumed its usual rhythm. I signed off my patrol, took a final look at the fading light over the ridge, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Another day in the forest, another problem solved, and another reminder that even in the most remote corners of the park, life and the work of keeping it safe went on with steady, measured certainty. The day ended clearly, with no unresolved danger, no lingering fear, just the quiet comfort of a job well done in a place where nature ran on its own terms, and I was simply there to make sure it stayed that way. I had been working as a park ranger for almost 6 years, and by that time, I had become intimately familiar with the trails, the wildlife, and the subtle shifts in the forest that most visitors never noticed. Early spring was one of my favorite times of the year. The snow was just starting to melt in the higher elevations. Streams were rushing with fresh meltwater, and the air carried that crisp, clean scent of wet pine and earth. That morning, I set out on my usual patrol, driving my old, beat-up Ford truck along the narrow dirt roads that wound through the backcountry. The sun was just coming up over the ridge, spilling gold across the treetops, and the forest seemed almost alive in a way it never did in the heat of summer. I had a routine route, checking trailheads, making sure gates were secured, inspecting fire pits for leftover embers, and keeping an eye out for anyone who might have wandered off the marked trails. My job wasn't glamorous, but it required patience and attention to detail. That day, I was headed to a lesser-used trail that led up to a small alpine lake. Few people made it this far. Most of the park's visitors stuck to the main trails near the parking lots. They made it quiet, peaceful, but also a little unpredictable. The first few hours passed without incident. I stopped at an old wooden bridge that crossed a narrow creek, checking the planks for rot and making mental notes about which ones would need replacing before the summer rush. The water ran clear and cold underneath, and a few trout could be seen darting back and forth beneath the surface. I always like to pause at spots like that, just to watch the wildlife and remind myself why I did this job. A few miles further up the road, I noticed tire tracks in the mud near a small pull-off. They were fresh, maybe a day or two old, and led down the overgrown trail that ran parallel to the lake. I stopped and examined them closely. The tracks were from a small SUV, but what caught my attention was that they wandered off the trail in a way that suggested someone had been trying to get closer to the lake without following the path. That raised a red flag. In this park, off-trail driving was strictly prohibited, partly because it damaged the delicate soil and plant life, and partly because it could lead to accidents in rough terrain. I followed the tracks slowly on foot, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. The forest here was dense, the canopy thick enough that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the ground. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the smell of damp earth was strong. After about half a mile, I found what I had been looking for. A small clearing opened up, and at the center, a vehicle was stuck in the mud. Its tires were spinning uselessly, leaving deep ruts. There was no one in sight, which made me uneasy. Vehicles didn't get stuck here by accident, especially this far back, and someone being alone this far into the backcountry was a serious safety concern. I radioed into the ranger station, describing the location and situation, and asked for backup in case someone was injured or needed assistance. While I waited, I approached the vehicle carefully, noting that the doors were unlocked, but there was no sign of anyone inside. The engine was cold. It struck me that the person had likely tried to continue on foot after getting stuck, and my mind immediately went to the potential dangers: exposure, uneven terrain, and wild animals. I knew the trails in this area could be deceptive, with sudden drop-offs hidden behind dense foliage. I began walking in the direction the tire tracks indicated the driver had gone. The forest grew thicker, the ground wetter, and the trail less distinguishable. I had to be careful with each step. A misstep could twist an ankle or worse. I followed footprints in the mud and soft earth, noting that they weren't alone. There were other impressions, likely from boots or shoes, and they seemed to double back in a confusing pattern. It was as though whoever was out here had become disoriented. After nearly an hour, I finally spotted a figure up ahead. It was a middle-aged man, leaning against a tree, looking exhausted. He had been attempting to find a shortcut back to the main trail and had gotten lost in the process. He looked relieved when he saw me and immediately tried to explain through gestures and ragged breathing that he had wandered for hours, unsure which way to go. I didn't need words. His condition told me everything. He was dehydrated, his clothes were muddy, and his face was streaked with sweat and dirt. I guided him carefully back toward the stuck vehicle, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was unforgiving to anyone who didn't respect it. When we reached the SUV, he collapsed into the driver's seat with a mix of relief and exhaustion. I radioed for a vehicle to tow it out, and within another half hour, we were back on the main road, heading toward the ranger station. At the station, I made sure he had water, a blanket, and a chance to rest before arranging for him to be escorted back to the park entrance. I filed the incident report, noting the potential hazards, the location of the vehicle, and the condition of the visitor. It was one of those days that reminded me why park safety protocols existed and why the job required constant vigilance. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had prevented a minor incident from turning into a major emergency. By the time I finished my paperwork, the sun was setting behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the valley. The forest was calm again, almost peaceful, and I could hear the distant rushing of streams mixing with the calls of evening birds. I drove back to the ranger station slowly, taking a moment to appreciate the stillness. The park was beautiful, dangerous, and unpredictable, but it was also a place where careful attention and preparedness could make the difference between disaster and safety. That day reinforced why I loved being a park ranger. It wasn't the glamour, the fame, or even the wilderness itself. It was being there, ready, and knowing that someone's safety depended on the diligence I brought to every step of the trail. // I remember that night clearly, even though it's been years. I was on a late patrol at the edge of the park, the sort of area that most visitors never saw. It was late autumn, the trees half stripped of their leaves, the air crisp, and the sky dark except for the faint glow of the moon. The forest had a quiet that felt almost unnatural, the kind of quiet where every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves echoed sharply, making you jump if you weren't careful. I had been working in this park for nearly 6 years, and I knew almost every trail, every bend in the river, every hidden slope where deer liked to gather. Yet, that night, the forest seemed different, heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. I had started my shift around dusk, driving my patrol truck slowly down the winding roads. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of fallen leaves and the occasional black shape of a tree trunk. I passed the usual spots where hikers left their cars overnight, checking for any abandoned vehicles or trouble signs. Everything seemed normal, which only made the stillness feel more ominous. I parked briefly at the ranger station's back lot to check my equipment. Flashlight batteries, radio, first aid kit, bear spray. I went through the checklist methodically. On nights like this, you never knew what could happen. By the time I got back on the road, the wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispering. I followed the narrow road that led to the northern trailheads, a path I rarely had to take at night. Usually, hikers were long gone by sunset, but occasionally someone would underestimate the dark and hike too late. My headlights briefly caught a deer, frozen in the road, its eyes reflecting red before it bolted into the shadows. I slowed, heart rate picking up slightly, reminding myself this was just nature, nothing more. About halfway through the northern loop, my radio crackled with static. I listened for a while, but no one was calling in. Just the faint hum of distant traffic from the nearby highway. I shrugged it off and continued driving slowly, hugging the curves. The road dipped down into a low valley where the trees grew denser, and the canopy blocked most of the moonlight. I turned off my high beams to avoid startling any wildlife and drove with the dimmed headlights, moving cautiously. My truck felt like the only human presence in miles. Then I saw it, a shape in the road, just ahead, roughly human in size but hunched. My heart jumped, and I slammed on the brakes, tires skidding slightly on the wet leaves. The shape didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, shining the beam across the road. For a moment, I thought I'd stumbled upon a hiker who had gotten lost. But as the light swept across, I realized it wasn't human. It was an old, abandoned deer carcass, bloated and partially eaten by smaller animals. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something in the shadows shifted, the sound of twigs breaking under heavier steps. I froze, listening. The noise didn't stop. It came closer, slow and deliberate. My flashlight swung toward the sound, and I caught a glimpse of movement, a black shape too large for a coyote, moving with a kind of fluid, silent grace. A mountain lion. I had seen them before in the park, but always from a distance. They usually avoided humans, but this one was different. It stopped when it saw me, just beyond the edge of the road, and stared. I stayed calm, reminding myself not to run, keeping my flashlight steady, making myself appear large. The mountain lion shifted slightly, then, as silently as it appeared, melted back into the trees. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into the truck. I sat there for a moment, taking deep breaths, knowing I had narrowly avoided an encounter that could have been deadly. The forest had reminded me how small and fragile I was out here, even with years of experience. I continued my patrol, slower now, eyes scanning every shadow, every tree line. I made sure to check the northern trailheads for anyone who might be stranded. Luckily, there was no one, just empty trails and the eerie, watchful forest. When I finally drove back toward the main ranger station, the first hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon, painting the sky with soft gray and pink streaks. The tension in my body eased as the familiar sounds of birds waking and squirrels rustling filled the air. By the time I parked back at the station, I was exhausted but relieved. That night reminded me why patience, caution, and respect for nature were critical in this job. I logged the sighting in my report, noting the location of the carcass and the likely presence of a mountain lion in the area to alert other rangers. Over the next few days, patrols were slightly adjusted, warning signs posted on the northern trailheads. Visitors never reported any incidents, and the forest went back to its quiet routine. It was one of those nights that stayed with me, the kind of memory that surfaces when I drive alone at night on forest roads or when I hear the distant cry of a wild animal. It reinforced why I became a ranger, not just to manage the park, but to witness and respect the raw, untamed world that exists just beyond the trails. Nature is beautiful, but is also powerful, unpredictable, and at times dangerous. And as long as I am here, someone will always be watching, making sure that both the animals and humans coexist safely. The memory of that night never frightened me in the sense of panic, but it gave me a deep, enduring respect. I understood more clearly the balance that exists in the forest, the invisible rules that govern life and survival out there. By acknowledging it, I could work safely, effectively, and responsibly. And that night ended with me back in the safety of the ranger station, logging the events, checking my gear again, and looking out the window at the quiet forest as the first true light of day finally revealed its calm, beautiful face. I had been a park ranger for almost 7 years, working in a sprawling national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The forest was massive, a mix of towering evergreens, dense underbrush, and winding dirt roads that seemed to disappear into the shadows. Most days were routine, patrolling trails, checking permits, ensuring campers followed fire safety rules, and occasionally rescuing someone who had gotten lost. But that year, I was assigned a new section of the park that included some of the oldest and densest parts of the forest. It was remote, quiet, and occasionally unsettling. The shift started in the late afternoon. I had parked my ranger truck near a maintenance trail that ran parallel to one of the main hiking routes. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and a faint chill had crept into the air. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, two-way radio, and a small bag of snacks. My plan was simple: a routine inspection of the back trails, checking for downed trees that could block paths, signs of unauthorized fires, and wildlife activity. As soon as I entered the forest, the familiar sounds surrounded me. Birds chirped faintly from above, leaves rustled in the light breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot echoed in the otherwise quiet woods. Despite having walked these trails countless times, there was a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Something about the stillness felt heavier than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I reminded myself it was probably just the change in season. Autumn brought longer shadows and cooler temperatures that always made the woods feel different. I followed the trail deeper into the forest. The path narrowed, with brambles and moss-covered rocks pressing in on either side. I passed a small creek where the water trickled over stones, forming miniature rapids. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong, almost intoxicating, and I took a moment to breathe it in. My boots sank slightly in the soft soil, and the occasional loose stone made my footing precarious. I kept my flashlight ready, although the remaining daylight was enough to see by for now. About an hour into my walk, I noticed something odd. There were tracks along the trail, partially obscured by fallen leaves. I crouched to examine them and realized they weren't typical wildlife tracks. The prints were large, maybe the size of small dog's paw, but the spacing suggested a much larger creature. Deer and elk were common, but these tracks had a different shape, more rounded, with slight claw marks. I took a picture with my phone and marked the GPS coordinates in case I needed to report it later. I shrugged off the unease, reminding myself that bears were not uncommon in this section. A large male bear could easily make tracks like these. Continuing along the trail, I noticed more signs of recent activity: broken branches, flattened grass, and scuffed marks on the bark of some trees. Nothing appeared aggressive, but it was enough to make me more alert. I switched on my flashlight preemptively, the beam cutting through the dimming light like a knife. Shadows stretched across the path, and every sound seemed amplified. Birds had fallen silent, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made me tense. I reached a small clearing where I usually took a short break. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a bottle of water, and scanned the surrounding forest. The clearing was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I sipped water slowly, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't close, but wasn't far either. My heart rate jumped. I froze, listening carefully. The growl repeated, a slow, deliberate rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once. I scanned the area, flashlight beam sweeping over trees and underbrush. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted intermittently. I reminded myself of the tracks. If it was a bear, it was probably observing me from a distance. I had bear spray on my belt and a small first aid kit in my pack. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, knowing sudden motion could provoke a wild animal. I decided to backtrack slightly and move along a different path that led to higher ground where I could see the clearing from above. The forest around me grew darker as the sun disappeared entirely behind the horizon. My flashlight was the only source of light, and the beam cut through the blackness, highlighting twisted tree trunks and ferns glistening with moisture. The growls continued, sporadic but persistent. Each time I thought I had pinpointed their location, the sounds seemed to shift, coming from another part of the clearing or further into the woods. I climbed a slight rise to gain a vantage point. From here, I could see more of the forest floor. The tracks I had seen earlier led toward a dense thicket. I could see the scuff marks on the trees more clearly now, fresh and deep, as if whatever had been here was moving purposefully. I kept my flashlight trained on the thicket, trying to see movement, but nothing emerged. My ranger training kicked in. Stay calm, observe, gather data. I took photos and made mental notes, planning to report this later. The air grew colder, and a light fog started creeping along the ground, curling around tree roots and rocks. It made the forest feel even more alien, muffling distant sounds and making shapes loom larger in the dark. I decided it was time to head back to my truck before night fully set in. I retraced my steps, careful to keep the flashlight beam ahead of me, scanning for any signs of movement. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the path, partially obscured by trees. A pair of eyes reflected the flashlight beam. They were low to the ground, and the intensity of the reflection suggested an animal of considerable size. My pulse quickened, but I stood still. The growl came again, louder this time. I realized it was a bear, likely a large male, guarding something or just curious about my presence. Bears were normally avoidant of humans, but this one didn't seem willing to leave. I slowly reached for my bear spray, keeping my stance low but deliberate. The bear didn't move immediately. Its posture was tense, ears forward, body low. I remember my training. No sudden movements, speak calmly if needed, and maintain distance. I slowly started backing away, keeping the eyes on my flashlight beam. The bear didn't charge, but it didn't retreat either. Each step I took seemed to take an eternity. Finally, after what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving the tracks and the clearing behind. I exhaled slowly, realizing how tense I had been. My hands shook slightly, gripping the flashlight and bear spray. The forest had returned to its quiet, almost peaceful state, though the adrenaline was still pumping through my veins. I made my way back to the truck carefully, checking my GPS coordinates to ensure I didn't lose the trail. The drive back to the ranger station was silent, my mind replaying every detail of the encounter. Back at the station, I logged the incident thoroughly. I included the photos of the tracks, the scuff marks, the approximate location, and my observations about the bear. I also noted the time of day, weather conditions, and any other anomalies. My supervisor acknowledged the report and reminded me to exercise caution in that section of the forest, especially at dusk or after dark. The days following, I returned to that trail several times during daylight hours. I documented more signs of wildlife activity, but nothing unusual compared to other parts of the forest. I realized that the tension I'd felt wasn't unusual. Being alone in a dense forest at dusk can amplify every sound and shadow. But the encounter served as a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be, and how crucial it is to remain alert and prepared. Weeks later, during a regular patrol, I encountered a team of wildlife biologists studying bear populations. They were thrilled to see the photos I had taken. According to them, the tracks matched a male bear known to roam that section of the forest. They explained that such bears were extremely territorial during certain months, especially as food sources began to dwindle in the fall. My encounter, they assured me, had been a textbook example of cautious observation and safety. By the end of that season, I had developed a deeper respect for the forest and the creatures that inhabited it. Each patrol, each walk through the dense trees, reminded me that being a park ranger wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding the land, respecting its power, and recognizing my own place within it. Looking back, that evening in the dense thicket had been one of the most intense moments of my career, not because of fear alone, but because it was a vivid lesson in patience, awareness, and respect. The forest, for all its beauty, had reminded me that life, there was neither predictable nor forgiving. And in that unpredictability, there was a strange sense of clarity, a clear, unwavering reminder that in nature, survival depends on knowledge, preparation, and a steady hand. I became a park ranger the way most people stumble into their jobs, slowly, and with a strange mix of certainty and doubt. I had grown up surrounded by mountains and forests, The kind of places that seemed to stretch on forever, where the sky touched jagged peaks and rivers carved deep valleys. After years of working odd jobs and moving between cities, I realized that I needed to be somewhere that mattered, somewhere where the hours spent outside didn't just pass by, but meant something. That's how I ended up at Cedar Ridge National Park. I didn't expect the work to be easy, but I never imagined how much it would test me, physically and mentally, in ways that I could not anticipate. I started my first shift in late spring. The air was still crisp in the mornings, even as the sun climbed higher, cutting through the dense canopy of pines and maples that stretched across the lower valleys. My mornings began early, before sunrise, driving the narrow, winding roads that followed the natural curves of the mountains. My truck was my lifeline, loaded with equipment: a first aid kit, a spare tire, a heavy-duty flashlight, a thermos of coffee, a map thick with folds, and a handheld radio that rarely worked properly when I needed it most. The first weeks were quiet. My days were filled with the repetitive but necessary tasks of a park ranger: checking trails for fallen trees, inspecting campsites for safety violations, patrolling the riverbanks, and occasionally dealing with lost hikers. I quickly learned that the forest, for all its beauty, demanded respect. Slipping on moss-covered rocks, underestimating the depth of a river crossing, or ignoring weather warnings could turn a routine day into a life-or-death situation. One afternoon, I decided to take a longer trail to inspect some of the more remote areas of the park. The trailhead started just beyond the main parking area, a narrow path lined with dense ferns and towering pines. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the trail. I had been walking for nearly 2 hours when I noticed something strange: a set of footprints, fresh in the mud, heading deeper into the forest. They were not human. The spacing and the claw marks suggested a large predator, possibly a bear, but the strides seemed too deliberate, too measured, as if the animal had been tracking something or someone. I made a mental note, marking the location on my map. Bears were not uncommon in these woods, but the sight of fresh tracks always put me on edge. I continued along the trail, careful to make noise to alert any wildlife of my presence. My flashlight, even though it was early evening, remained strapped to my chest. I didn't trust the fading daylight in these remote areas. The further I walked, the quieter the forest became. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, tense kind where every sound, every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch made my heart race. I reached a clearing where the ground sloped steeply downward to a small creek. The creek ran fast and clear, tumbling over rocks and roots. I knelt down to check the water and noticed more tracks along the bank. The creature, or creatures, had moved along the water, leaving prints pressed deep into the muddy soil. My gut tightened. I knew these were not just ordinary bear tracks. The spacing and gaits suggested something much larger, a force I had not expected. Night fell quickly in the mountains. I checked my radio again, still dead air. Cell signal in this part of the park was non-existent. My only choice was to keep moving back toward the trailhead. As I retraced my steps, the feeling of being watched grew heavier. I could not see anything, but the hairs on my neck stood up. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, branches swaying without wind, dark shapes slipping between the trees. I told myself it was an overactive imagination. I had trained for emergencies, I had faced wildlife encounters before, and I had survived alone in the backcountry. But this was different. By the time I reached the area where the trail forked, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere uphill. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew running could provoke whatever it was. I paused, listening carefully, and caught a second sound, a branch snapping behind me. The growl had come closer. My flashlight beam swept across the trail, catching glimpses of movement, shadows larger than any deer slipping between the trees, keeping just out of clear sight. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Every step I took was careful, deliberate, heavy with tension. I started moving backward slowly, keeping my eyes on the darkness. The growls became intermittent, as if the animal was sizing me up, deciding whether I was prey or not. I reminded myself to stay calm, to make myself appear large, to keep noise to a minimum. But in the back of my mind, I knew that in this remote part of the park, my only allies were the truck, my instincts, and whatever luck I had left. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the faint glow of the trailhead lights. Relief flooded me, but it was tempered by exhaustion and the lingering tension of being hunted. I hurried the last few hundred meters, my flashlight barely illuminating the path, until I reached my truck. The moment I slid into the seat, I locked the doors, fumbling to start the engine. The truck roared to life. I didn't look back as I drove down the winding road, the forest looming on either side like a living, breathing entity. When I reached the ranger station, I reported the tracks and the encounter. Other rangers nodded, acknowledging the possibility of a large predator in the area, perhaps a road bear or an unusually aggressive mountain lion. Patrols were increased for the next several weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that there was something else, something unaccounted for, something that had studied me, waited for me to wander alone. Over the next months, my shifts were filled with reports of similar tracks, sightings, and occasional disturbances. I spent countless nights patrolling, flashlight in hand, listening for the low growl that had haunted me that evening. I checked every trail, every clearing, every creek crossing. I mapped the tracks, noting patterns, trying to predict where the animal or animals might move next. The forest, once familiar and comforting, had transformed into something unpredictable, alive with hidden dangers. Then, one late autumn night, I encountered it again. I was patrolling a different section of the park, near the western ridges where the trees grew sparse and the wind cut through like a knife. The trail was covered in frost, crunching under my boots. The low growl echoed through the ridges, closer than before. I froze, scanning the darkness, the flashlight beam cutting across trees and rocks. There it was, a massive black shape, moving between the trunks, silent but deliberate. Its eyes reflected the light, cold and intelligent. I realized with a jolt that this was not a typical animal encounter. The creature was assessing me, calculating, patient. I stayed still, breathing slowly, waiting for it to lose interest. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It's impossible to tell in the backcountry. Finally, it retreated, slipping into the shadows like it had never been there. I exhaled, the tension leaving my body in one long, shaky breath. I drove back to the station, shaken but resolute. I knew then that my job was not just about protecting the park or enforcing rules. It was about surviving in a wild, unpredictable world, about understanding that nature held its own codes and boundaries that humans could never fully control. By the time winter arrived, I had adapted to the rhythm of the park. I patrolled icy trails, checked on trapped or injured wildlife, and monitored visitors for safety. I no longer feared the darkness as much, but I respected it in a way I hadn't before. The forest had revealed its teeth to me, and I had survived, not because of luck, but because of vigilance, preparation, and a willingness to face the unknown. That encounter remained with me, a reminder that even in the most familiar environments, life was unpredictable. I logged the details meticulously, noting the patterns, the behavior, and the locations. I shared the information with fellow rangers, hoping that it would aid in understanding the park's complex ecosystem. Over time, sightings became less frequent. Perhaps the creature moved on, or perhaps it had simply chosen to remain unseen. Either way, I had learned that vigilance was not optional. It was essential, and that respect for the wilderness was not just a moral imperative, but a survival tool. I had been a park ranger for almost 7 years, working in a sprawling national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The forest was massive, a mix of towering evergreens, dense underbrush, and winding dirt roads that seemed to disappear into the shadows. Most days were routine, patrolling trails, checking permits, ensuring campers followed fire safety rules, and occasionally rescuing someone who had gotten lost. But that year, I was assigned a new section of the park that included some of the oldest and densest parts of the forest. It was remote, quiet, and occasionally unsettling. The shift started in the late afternoon. I had parked my ranger truck near a maintenance trail that ran parallel to one of the main hiking routes. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and a faint chill had crept into the air. I grabbed my gear: flashlight, first aid kit, two-way radio, and a small bag of snacks. My plan was simple: a routine inspection of the back trails, checking for downed trees that could block paths, signs of unauthorized fires, and wildlife activity. As soon as I entered the forest, the familiar sounds surrounded me. Birds chirped faintly from above, leaves rustled in the light breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot echoed in the otherwise quiet woods. Despite having walked these trails countless times, there was a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Something about the stillness felt heavier than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I reminded myself it was probably just the change in season. Autumn brought longer shadows and cooler temperatures that always made the woods feel different. I followed the trail deeper into the forest. The path narrowed, with brambles and moss-covered rocks pressing in on either side. I passed a small creek where the water trickled over stones, forming miniature rapids. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong, almost intoxicating, and I took a moment to breathe it in. My boots sank slightly in the soft soil, and the occasional loose stone made my footing precarious. I kept my flashlight ready, although the remaining daylight was enough to see by for now. About an hour into my walk, I noticed something odd. There were tracks along the trail, partially obscured by fallen leaves. I crouched to examine them, and realized they weren't typical wildlife tracks. The prints were large, maybe the size of a small dog's paw, but the spacing suggested a much larger creature. Deer and elk were common, but these tracks had a different shape, more rounded with slight claw marks. I took a picture with my phone and marked the GPS coordinates in case I needed to report later. I shrugged off the unease, reminding myself that bears were not uncommon in this section. A large male bear could easily make tracks like these. Continuing along the trail, I noticed more signs of recent activity: broken branches, flattened grass, and scuffed marks on the bark of some trees. Nothing appeared aggressive, but it was enough to make me more alert. I switched on my flashlight preemptively, the beam cutting through the dimming light like a knife. Shadows stretched across the path, and every sound seemed amplified. Birds had fallen silent, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made me tense. I reached a small clearing where I usually took a short break. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a bottle of water, and scanned the surrounding forest. The clearing was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I sipped water slowly, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My heart rate jumped. I froze, listening carefully. The growl repeated, a slow, deliberate rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once. I scanned the area, flashlight beam sweeping over trees and underbrush. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted intermittently. I reminded myself of the tracks. If it was a bear, it was probably observing me from a distance. I had bear spray on my belt and a small first aid kit in my pack. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, knowing sudden motion could provoke a wild animal. I decided to backtrack slightly and move along a different path that led to higher ground where I could see the clearing from above. The forest around me grew darker as the sun disappeared entirely behind the horizon. My flashlight was the only source of light, and the beam cut through the blackness, highlighting twisted tree trunks and ferns glistening with moisture. The growls continued, sporadic but persistent. Each time I thought I had pinpointed their location, the sound seemed to shift, coming from another part of the clearing or further into the woods. I climbed a slight rise to gain a vantage point. From here, I could see more of the forest floor. The tracks I had seen earlier led toward a dense thicket. I could see the scuff marks on the trees more clearly now, fresh and deep, as if whatever had been here was moving purposefully. I kept my flashlight trained on the thicket, trying to see movement, but nothing emerged. My ranger training kicked in. Stay calm, observe, gather data. I took photos and made mental notes, planning to report this later. The air grew colder, and a light fog started creeping along the ground, curling around tree roots and rocks. It made the forest feel even more alien, muffling distant sounds and making shapes loom larger in the dark. I decided it was time to head back to my truck before night fully set in. I retraced my steps, careful to keep the flashlight beam ahead of me, scanning for any signs of movement. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the path, partially obscured by trees. A pair of eyes reflected the flashlight beam. They were low to the ground, and the intensity of the reflection suggested an animal of considerable size. My pulse quickened, but I stood still. The growl came again, louder this time. I realized it was a bear, likely a large male, guarding something or just curious about my presence. Bears were normally avoidant of humans, but this one didn't seem willing to leave. I slowly reached for my bear spray, keeping my stance low but deliberate. The bear didn't move immediately. Its posture was tense, ears forward, body low. I remember my training. No sudden movements, speak calmly if needed, and maintain distance. I slowly started backing away, keeping the eyes on my flashlight beam. The bear didn't charge, but it didn't retreat either. Each step I took seemed to take an eternity. Finally, after what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving the tracks and the clearing behind. I exhaled slowly, realizing how tense I had been. My hands shook slightly, gripping the flashlight and bear spray. The forest had returned to its quiet, almost peaceful state, though the adrenaline was still pumping through my veins. I made my way back to the truck carefully, checking my GPS coordinates to ensure I didn't lose the trail. The drive back to the ranger station was silent, my mind replaying every detail of the encounter. Back at the station, I logged the incident thoroughly. I included the photos of the tracks, the scuff marks, the approximate location, and my observations about the bear. I also noted the time of day, weather conditions, and any other anomalies. My supervisor acknowledged the report and reminded me to exercise caution in that section of the forest, especially at dusk or after dark. The days following, I returned to that trail several times during daylight hours. I documented more signs of wildlife activity, but nothing unusual compared to other parts of the forest. I realized that the tension I had felt wasn't unusual. Being alone in a dense forest at dusk can amplify every sound and shadow. But the encounter served as a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be and how crucial it is to remain alert and prepared. Weeks later, during a regular patrol, I encountered a team of wildlife biologists studying bear populations. They were thrilled to see the photos I had taken. According to them, the tracks matched a male bear known to roam that section of the forest. They explained that such bears were extremely territorial during certain months, especially as food sources began to dwindle in the fall. My encounter, they assured me, had been a textbook example of cautious observation and safety. By the end of that season, I had developed a deeper respect for the forest and the creatures that inhabited it. Each patrol, each walk through the dense trees, reminded me that being a park ranger wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding the land, respecting its power, and recognizing my own place within it. Looking back, that evening in the dense thicket had been one of the most intense moments of my career, not because of fear alone, but because it was a vivid lesson in patience, awareness, and respect. The forest, for all its beauty, had reminded me that life, there was neither predictable nor forgiving. And in that unpredictability, there was a strange sense of clarity, a clear, unwavering reminder that in nature, survival depends on knowledge, preparation, and a steady hand. I have been a park ranger for almost 7 years, working in a sprawling national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The forest was massive, a mix of towering evergreens, dense underbrush, and winding dirt roads that seemed to disappear into the shadows. Most days were routine, patrolling trails, checking permits, ensuring campers followed fire safety rules, and occasionally rescuing someone who had gotten lost. But that year, I was assigned a new section of the park that included some of the oldest and densest parts of the forest. It was remote, quiet, and occasionally unsettling. The shift started in the late afternoon. I had parked my ranger truck near a maintenance trail that ran parallel to one of the main hiking routes. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, and a faint chill had crept into the air. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, two-way radio, and a small bag of snacks. My plan was simple, a routine inspection of the back trails, checking for downed trees that could block paths, signs of unauthorized fires, and wildlife activity. As soon as I entered the forest, the familiar sound surrounded me. Birds chirped faintly from above, leaves rustled in the light breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot echoed in the otherwise quiet woods. Despite having walked these trails countless times, there was a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Something about the stillness felt heavier than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I reminded myself it was probably just a change in season. Autumn brought longer shadows and cooler temperatures that always made the woods feel different. I followed the trail deeper into the forest. The path narrowed, with brambles and moss-covered rocks pressing in on either side. I passed a small creek where the water trickled over stones, forming miniature rapids. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong, almost intoxicating, and I took a moment to breathe it in. My boots sank slightly in the soft soil, and the occasional loose stone made my footing precarious. I kept my flashlight ready, although the remaining daylight was enough to see by for now. About an hour into my walk, I noticed something odd. There were tracks along the trail, partially obscured by fallen leaves. I crouched to examine them and realized they weren't typical wildlife tracks. The prints were large, maybe the size of a small dog's paw, but the spacing suggested a much larger creature. Deer and elk were common, but these tracks had a different shape, more rounded, with slight claw marks. I took a picture with my phone and marked the GPS coordinates in case I needed to report it later. I shrugged off the unease, reminding myself that bears were not uncommon in this section. A large male bear could easily make tracks like these. Continuing along the trail, I noticed more signs of recent activity: broken branches, flattened grass, and scuffed marks on the bark of some trees. Nothing appeared aggressive, but it was enough to make me more alert. I switched on my flashlight preemptively, the beam cutting through the dimming light like a knife. Shadows stretched across the path, and every sound seemed amplified. Birds had fallen silent, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made me tense. I reached a small clearing where I usually took a short break. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a bottle of water, and scanned the surrounding forest. The clearing was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I sipped water slowly, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My heart rate jumped. I froze, listening carefully. The growl repeated, a slow, deliberate rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once. I scanned the area, flashlight beams sweeping over trees and underbrush. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted intermittently. I reminded myself of the tracks. If it was a bear, it was probably observing me from a distance. I had bear spray on my belt and a small first aid kit in my pack. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, knowing sudden motion could provoke a wild animal. I decided to backtrack slightly and move along a different path that led to higher ground where I could see the clearing from above. The forest around me grew darker as the sun disappeared entirely behind the horizon. My flashlight was the only source of light, and the beam cut through the blackness, highlighting twisted tree trunks and ferns glistening with moisture. The growls continued, sporadic but persistent. Each time I thought I had pinpointed their location, the sound seemed to shift, coming from another part of the clearing or further into the woods. I climbed a slight rise to gain a vantage point. From here, I could see more of the forest floor. The tracks I had seen earlier led toward a dense thicket. I could see the scuff marks on the trees more clearly now, fresh and deep, as if whatever had been here was moving purposefully. I kept my flashlight trained on the thicket, trying to see movement, but nothing emerged. My ranger training kicked in. Stay calm, observe, gather data. I took photos and made mental notes, planning to report this later. The air grew colder, and a light fog started creeping along the ground, curling around tree roots and rocks. It made the forest feel even more alien, muffling distant sounds and making shapes loom larger in the dark. I decided it was time to head back to my truck before night fully set in. I retraced my steps, careful to keep the flashlight beam ahead of me, scanning for any signs of movement. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the path, partially obscured by trees. A pair of eyes reflected the flashlight beam. They were low to the ground, and the intensity of the reflection suggested an animal of considerable size. My pulse quickened, but I stood still. The growl came again, louder this time. I realized it was a bear, likely a large male, guarding something or just curious about my presence. Bears were normally avoidant of humans, but this one didn't seem willing to leave. I slowly reached for my bear spray, keeping my stance low but deliberate. The bear didn't move immediately. Its posture was tense, ears forward, body low. I remember my training. No sudden movements, speak calmly if needed, and maintain distance. I slowly started backing away, keeping the eyes on my flashlight beam. The bear didn't charge, but it didn't retreat either. Each step I took seemed to take an eternity. Finally, after what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving the tracks and the clearing behind. I exhaled slowly, realizing how tense I had been. My hands shook slightly, gripping the flashlight and bear spray. The forest had returned to its quiet, almost peaceful state, though the adrenaline was still pumping through my veins. I made my way back to the truck carefully, checking my GPS coordinates to ensure I didn't lose the trail. The drive back to the ranger station was silent, my mind replaying every detail of the encounter. Back at the station, I logged the incident thoroughly. I included the photos of the tracks, the scuff marks, the approximate location, and my observations about the bear. I also noted the time of day, weather conditions, and any other anomalies. My supervisor acknowledged the report and reminded me to exercise caution in that section of the forest, especially at dusk or after dark. The days following, I returned to that trail several times during daylight hours. I documented more signs of wildlife activity, but nothing unusual compared to other parts of the forest. I realized that the tension I'd felt wasn't unusual. Being alone in a dense forest at dusk can amplify every sound and shadow. But the encounter served as a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be, and how crucial it is to remain alert and prepared. Weeks later, during a regular patrol, I encountered a team of wildlife biologists studying bear populations. They were thrilled to see the photos I had taken. According to them, the tracks matched a male bear known to roam that section of the forest. They explained that such bears were extremely territorial during certain months, especially as food sources began to dwindle in the fall. My encounter, they assured me, had been a textbook example of cautious observation and safety. By the end of that season, I had developed a deeper respect for the forest and the creatures that inhabited it. Each patrol, each walk through the dense trees, reminded me that being a park ranger wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding the land, respecting its power, and recognizing my own place within it. Looking back, that evening in the dense thicket had been one of the most intense moments of my career. Not because of fear alone, but because it was a vivid lesson in patience, awareness, and respect. The forest, for all its beauty, had reminded me that life, there was neither predictable nor forgiving. And in that unpredictability, there was a strange sense of clarity, a clear, unwavering reminder that in nature, survival depends on knowledge, preparation, and a steady hand.